private. As many of that opinion say aye. The contrary, no. No. I'll just try the ayes again. The question is this House sit in private. As many of that opinion say aye. The contrary, no. No. Okay. Division. Have it. Sorry. The noes have it. Let's carry on. Right. I thought there was not to call it. The clerk will now proceed to read the orders of the day.
Terminally ill adults end-of-life bill, as amended in the Public Bill Committee, to be considered.
Now.
No. Before I begin proceedings, I'd like to say a few words about today's proceedings. New clauses and amendments are grouped in two groups for debate. This is to enable two clear and coherent debates on aspects of the bill. Shortly, I will call the member in charge to move her new clause 10. Debate on the first group will take place on the question that new clause 10 be read a second time. If that question is agreed to, I'm minded to select Amendment A to new clause 10 in the name of Rebecca Paul for separate division. We have more than 90 members who have indicated that they wish to speak in the first debate. Not all honourable members will be called. It is not customary to impose a speech limit on private members' bill, but I hope that members in charge of the bill and the Speaker after that, members will restrict themselves in the early part of the debate to no more than 15 minutes in the first instance, and that includes taking interventions, and it will have to drop accordingly thereafter. The Chair will review that guidance, as I say, as the debate progresses. We need to ask for shorter speeches to enable more members to contribute. I shall make it clear that the Chair retains the right to impose a formal speech limit, but I'd rather colleagues help each other. This is a very important debate. This divides in different ways. So please, today is an opportunity, primarily, for backbenchers. I do not expect to call front benchers to speak till at least 1:30. So we will now begin with new clause 10, with which it will be convenient to consider other selected new clauses and amendments in Group 1 as listed on the selection paper. I now call Kim Leadbeater to move new clause 10.
Yeah. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's a privilege to open the debate on this next important stage of the Terminally Ill Adults End-of-Life Bill. It seems a long time ago since we held the second reading debate back in November on what I think many of us felt was a very proud day for Parliament, where we saw an emotional and passionate but largely respectful debate on what is a hugely important subject which means so much to so many people. Mr. Speaker, I know that there are a range of views on the subject of choice at the end of life, and I know that today is not about revisiting the fundamental principle of assisted dying, but as the sponsor of the bill, if I may, before I address the amendments in my name, I will make some brief introductory comments as to why we are here. And put simply, if we do not vote to change the law, we are essentially saying that the status quo is acceptable. And over recent months, I've heard hundreds of stories from people who have lost loved ones in deeply difficult and traumatic circumstances, which show that that is clearly not the case. Too many have seen their terminally ill loved ones take their own lives out of desperation, or make the traumatic, lonely and costly trip to Switzerland, and then face a police investigation while dealing with their grief and loss.
Would you give way?
I will give way.
I thank my honourable friend for giving way. She mentioned many real stories influencing this debate. I'd like to mention just one more from my own constituent, Mick Murray, who is in the public gallery today. Mick helped two close friends, Bob and Anne, make the painful journey to Dignitas. Both simply wanted to die at home with dignity, surrounded by loved ones. Instead, they had to make that journey overseas at great cost and legal jeopardy. Mick said, I helped them out of compassion, and I think that is what is missing from the current law. Does my honourable friend agree with Mick?
Please, we're going to set the example by following the rules of the House. Short interventions, not speeches. There's a lot of other members.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank my honourable friend for that intervention. And it was a very powerful point, if slightly long. But it is an important point that there are people who are facing these really traumatic, difficult decisions every day, including Louise Shackleton, who I believe is also with us today.
A point of order.
I thought the debate was to discuss amendments and not a general debate.
It is about that, but I think this is the opening leading to the amendments. But I will make the judgment of that call. Kim Leadbeater.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. If I may just finish that point, I will give way.
Can I just say to people, if you're going to have continuous intervention, don't be shocked if you end up at the bottom of the list if you continue to make people making the same intervention. I just want to help people, because all you're doing is soaking up time. Jim Shannon will be a good example.
Mr. Speaker, I'll always be at the end, so for me it's very important to ask an intervention. Can I ask the Honourable Lady, at the second reading, she set the scene very well, but since then things have changed. For instance, the Royal School of Psychiatry has said that they have voiced strong concerns opposing the bill. They talk about in regard to judicial oversight, robust protections against coercion, etc., and the effect it will have upon those vulnerable groups, those with dementia, Down syndrome, mental illnesses. Does the Honourable Lady not respect those viewpoints of my constituents who tell me they're opposed to this bill in principle and all the things coming forward? And this, I feel, doesn't address the issue the Honourable Lady is referring to.
Kim Leadbeater.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the Honourable Gentleman for his intervention. He's absolutely right. There are a range of views on this issue, and I'm deeply respectful of that, and I take all those points into consideration as we embark upon this debate again today. And perhaps, Mr. Speaker, most importantly, I've spoken to terminally ill people themselves over recent months, and I think it's impossible to know what it must feel like to receive a terminal diagnosis. And I have nothing but admiration for people who have bravely spoken about their personal situations, some publicly, including, of course, Dame Esther Ranson, and others who have done so privately, many by emailing their MP. And I know mine is not the only inbox full of those emails. Yeah. I also want to thank colleagues here in Parliament, of course.
Thank you for giving way. Will my honourable friend distance herself from the correspondence from Dame Esther Ranson, who accused those of us who have concerns about the bill as having undeclared religious beliefs? Many colleagues found this distasteful and disrespectful.
I thank you for that intervention. I haven't seen those comments, but it's absolutely right that whatever our views are on this issue, we must remain respectful. And I also want to thank colleagues here in Parliament, MPs and indeed staff, who've shared their personal stories of loss with me over recent months. These are, and this is a really important point, these are real people with real stories, and they must always be at the heart of the debate. Mr. Speaker, public support for assisted dying in this country has been consistently high for a long time now, and we've seen movement in jurisdictions around the world, including, of course, just this week in Scotland. And I want to congratulate colleagues in Holyrood, and particularly Liam MacArthur MSP, for such a compassionate and respectful debate, which I hope we can emulate here today. It is right that we consider this change with great care, as we are doing today. But we should also remember, as with other big social changes, like giving women bodily autonomy regarding their reproductive rights, or allowing gay...
Order. Thank you. We did say, as we've had this conversation, a very early introduction. I think that's why members will begin to get frustrated. We should be now speaking to the amendments. Kim Leadbeater.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I will move on to those amendments. If I can just acknowledge the work of the Bill Committee in relation to those amendments, because there was a huge amount of work done by members across the House with a range of views.
Look, I'm really bothered because it's the day for the amendments, and we really need to understand the views of the amendments. And as the member in charge of the bill, I'm sure that you really want to get into the depth of the amendments and not continue in the role. Kim Leadbeater.
I do indeed, Mr. Speaker. You're absolutely right. But the amendments that we're discussing today do build on some of the work of the committee, and as such, I think that is important. We took a lot of steps to strengthen the bill during the Bill Committee, and I was pleased to work collaboratively with colleagues in that way. Mr. Speaker, and again, as I come on to those amendments, which have been tabled in my name, the Government is, of course, neutral on the issue of assisted dying, but has always been clear that workability is essential if the bill is to pass. So I've worked closely with an outstanding team of civil servants from the Department of Health and Social Care and the Ministry of Justice, and it is with their technical advice regarding amendments tabled today to make the bill workable and to give coherence to the statute book that I am tabling these amendments in my name. Of course.
Friend for giving way. Would she confirm that those civil servants are 100% comfortable with the impact of this bill with people of disability, mental health issues, neurodiversity, and other medical conditions, and the fact that they will not be coerced or under pressure because of this bill?
I thank you for that intervention. I mean, the civil servants are clearly neutral on the issue, so they certainly haven't expressed any opinions with regard to the content of the bill. What they have done is merely provide the technical advice and expertise, and have done so brilliantly in that regard. So I come on to new clause 10, amendment 52 and new schedule 1 tabled in my name. Mr Speaker, as well as correcting the injustices in the legal situation, one of the key tenets of this bill is choice. Choice for dying people. But it's also very important that there is choice for doctors, other healthcare professionals, and indeed anyone else. The bill was always clear that no registered medical practitioner or other health professional is under any duty to participate in the provision of assistance in accordance with the Act. But this new clause expands that protection. It broadens the people to whom it applies and the functions to which it relates. It also introduces new Schedule 1, which makes provision for enforcement of this right not to be subject to any detriment in connection with the bill. Mr Speaker, of course I will.
I'm very grateful to her for giving way. Does she accept that there may be a weakness in new Schedule 1 in as far as it protects a person from actions taken by their employer? It may not necessarily protect, say, an agency worker who is contracted to perform a service, but then the original medical body decides not to then re-engage that person's services.
I thank you for that intervention. I mean, I would refer him to my previous comments that the bill and these clauses and these schedules have been drafted with the highest level of legal expertise, so this isn't something I anticipate as being a problem. Of course.
The bill does allow applicants to shop around for doctors. Yes. And it strikes me that there is a danger that some doctors will specialise in the provision of that service, who might have an ideological view of this bill, giving it rather greater scope than she intends.
I reject the assertion that patients will shop around. Bearing in mind we're talking about dying people, they're not in a position to start shopping around for services. But I also agree that the bill is particularly strict in that regard. There are very strict protocols to be followed that doctors have to follow. I'm just going to make some progress, if I may. Yeah, so this isn't just about patient choice, it's also about choice for professional people as well. And again, we know there are a range of views on assisted dying across a range of professions. And I've always been clear that no one who is uncomfortable taking part should have to. And nor should there be any detriment to anyone, whatever choice they choose to make, in whatever role they have. New clause 10, I will give it.
Thank you very much to my honourable friend for giving way. It's welcome that this new clause seeks to protect more individuals, but can she say why she's still not chosen to make provision for hospices and care homes to opt out without having their funding threatened?
I thank the honourable for giving way. There is absolutely nothing in the bill which has got any suggestion that any funding would be impacted by whatever decisions organisations make around assisted dying. And I'll make some progress, Mr Speaker. New clause 10 subsection 1 states very clearly that no person is under any duty to participate in the provision of assistance in accordance with this Act. And this is something I feel strongly on a personal level. If people don't want to be involved, they shouldn't have to be involved, and those that do should. Subsection 5 covers pharmacists and pharmacy technicians, and new Schedule 1 provides comprehensive employment protections. So I hope that whatever colleagues' views are on assisted dying, they will see the value of these changes and support them. Yes.
I'm very grateful to her for giving way. I thank her for these amendments, because a number of people have written to me concerned about the very issue that she is raising. Does she agree with me that there are many people who will just be opposed to assisted dying in all its forms, and I entirely respect that. But if that is really their objection, they should be honest about that and not pretend that it's only particular amendments they need. And really, they should make the argument that they really want to make.
I thank him for that intervention, and I agree. We must be respectful, but we must also be honest with each other. Mr Speaker, in relation to Amendment A to new clause 10 from the member for Reigate, who I would like to thank for her work on the Bill Committee, I understand the thinking behind this amendment, but I worry that there are unintended consequences in terms of patient care and protection. And I've been advised that that is the case, which I think the Minister will speak to. I think there is consensus across the House that in the interest of patient safety, it's vital that there is clear and open communication and sharing of information between healthcare professionals and within the assisted dying process. If an employer can stop their whole workforce from participating in any sort of assisted dying services, it could prevent the sharing of information or the recording of information in a patient's records. And this could be in relation to safeguarding and could put patients at risk as a result of the employer's decision. Terminally ill patients may be receiving different treatment at different places from different healthcare professionals. And if they were not able to transfer information or records, it would potentially be harmful. And there are workability issues with the amendment. It's not clear how it would work with regard to the requirement of professionals in subsection 7 of new clause 10 in terms of providing information to an assessing doctor about a patient, someone who they may have previously treated, or in relation to information about a specific condition they may specialise in. This information would need to be provided in the interest of patient care. An employee will always be bound by their contract of employment, of course, but flexibility is needed as many health and care professionals work for multiple employers. It's not uncommon for clinical staff to have more than one employer. For example, a doctor may be employed by the NHS but also work for a hospice, so it's not a straightforward scenario. And just as it would be wrong for anyone to be compelled to be involved in the process, it would be wrong for anyone to be prevented from doing so, particularly if there was an impact on patient safety. So because of these unintended... I will give way.
I thank her for giving way. Before the second reading, I held a public meeting where I heard a range of views from my constituents, and one thing that kept coming up was the need to protect medical professionals from being compelled to take part in assisted dying. I'm really pleased to see that being addressed in new clause 10. But does she not agree, just as she said, that having the choice to take part must go both ways for medical professionals?
I thank him for the intervention, and he's absolutely right, and we keep coming back to that word choice. It is choice for patients, it's choice for terminally ill people, but it is choice for medical professionals and others as well. So because of these unintended consequences, I can't support the amendment, but I am confident that new clause 10 and new schedule 1 provide robust protections for employees, whatever their choices are, about participating in the provision of assisted dying services. I will.
Thank the Honourable Lady for giving way. Would she mind elaborating a little bit more on the detail around the transferring of medical records? Because it's my understanding that you can request your own medical records as a patient.
I thank you for that intervention. I think the patient could request information, but so could doctors and other healthcare professionals, and it would be wrong if they were not allowed to share that information if it was requested, even if their employer was saying that they didn't want them to do it. And I turn to new clause 11 and consequential amendments 64 and 65. These amendments ensure the bill is workable by making provision about the replacement of the coordinating doctor or the independent doctor where the doctor is unable or unwilling to continue to carry out their functions within the bill. The doctor may be ill or on holiday, retire, or have a change of personal circumstances. Flexibility is important. Of course I will.
What concerns me, thank you, Mr. Speaker. What concerns me about new clause 11 is that essentially people can shop around if one doctor is unwilling. She's given a list of just there of reasons why the doctor might be unwilling, but surely one of the reasons the doctor might be unwilling is they have a fundamental change in the circumstance of that person and don't want to do it. Nothing about that is then recorded. Is that not a real weakness in this bill, this new clause, that actually we don't have that passing on of evidence from one doctor to another?
I thank you for that intervention. This isn't about eligibility, it is about the doctor's change of circumstances rather than the patient's. So if the doctor decides the person isn't eligible, then they would reject the application. So it wouldn't be a question of that. And they would record that in the patient's records, of course. So it would be there, it would be transparent. I'm going to make some progress, if I may. So, Mr. Speaker, this is essential about providing flexibility for doctors, but also ensuring continuity of care for patients. And I hope colleagues can support these amendments. Mr. Speaker, coming to new clause 12, this new clause ensures enough reporting of instances. I'm just going to make a little bit more progress, if I may, because there's a lot of people who want to speak. This new clause 12 ensures thorough reporting of instances where the coordinating doctor concludes that the patient does not meet the strict eligibility criteria as set out in the bill. It's very important that this data is recorded, but at present there's no requirement for the coordinating doctor to produce a report when they are not satisfied of all matters as set out in clause 23 subsection 5, meaning they do not provide the person with the approved substance. This lack of a reporting obligation does not align with the rest of the bill, hence this amendment, which I'm sure colleagues will feel it's very important to support. The report must also set out... I will give way.
Thank you very much for giving way to my honourable friend. Whilst it's important that a doctor's reasons for refusing to provide assistance are noted down, there's nothing currently in the bill that would ensure that if the person made another request in the future, the next coordinating doctor will be made aware of that doctor's report. Can she say anything to reassure those of us with concerns that people who are suffering from mental ill health, including depression, may seek assistance repeatedly until they find a doctor who will assess them as eligible?
I thank you for that intervention, but that wouldn't be an issue because copies of the report would be given to the patient and to the coordinating doctor if they were not in that GP's practice, but also to the Commissioner as well. So that information would be recorded. And it's very important that this data is recorded. The report must set out the reasons. I'm going to make some progress, if I may. I'm trying to be very open to interventions, but I do need to crack on. The report must set out why the coordinating doctor is not satisfied, and it must contain an explanation of why the patient cannot proceed with the assisted dying process. The coordinating doctor, as I've just said, must give a copy of the report to the person. If the coordinating doctor is not a practitioner within the person's GP practice, they must give a copy to the practice and also to the Voluntary Assisted Dying Commissioner. This reflects the thorough and robust reporting and monitoring mechanisms which exist throughout the bill. Mr Speaker, I now come to the other amendments tabled in my name, and I'm going to try and keep my comments succinct, as I know there are many colleagues here today who wish to speak. Amendment 56 ensures that the coordinating doctor gives the Commissioner a copy of the patient's first declaration. This enables the Commissioner to carry out their monitoring responsibilities under clause 45 of the bill. Amendments 57 and 61, I will give way.
Thank you, Mrs. Leadbeater. I thank the Honourable Lady for giving way. When considering this bill, I had presumed that the doctor concerned would be a senior clinician, a senior doctor, but the impact assessment on page 63 makes reference to pre-registration doctors who've just completed medical school but not yet been only on a provisional registration. Can she confirm that it is her intention that this bill will be completed by the most junior doctors as well as more senior consultants and general practitioners?
I thank her for the intervention, and given her background, she knows what she's talking about. Look, there would be regulations made which would set out the level of expertise required by the doctor, but there would also be training for every single doctor that took part in assisted dying processes. And that is done well around the world. There's other work that we can build on in that regard. Where did I get to? Amendments 57 and 61 are essentially, Mr Speaker, tidying up amendments which modify the wording of the duty of the Secretary of State in respect of training requirements in clauses 7 and 10, which fits in with the intervention from my honourable friend across the way there. Training is of paramount importance within the assisted dying process, and there will be a period of years where anybody who opts in to be part of this process will have thorough and robust training. Due to amendments made at committee stage with very good intention, the wording as it currently stands would suggest that the regulations themselves must include details about training, which obviously wouldn't make sense and would be unworkable, as it would obviously have to be done separately. Similarly, Amendment 58 removes unclear drafting as a result of changes made at Bill Committee, which could have the effect that the regulations would have to contain training about training, which obviously doesn't make sense. Mr Speaker, Amendments 59, 52, 74 and 62 are also tidying up amendments which are necessary as a result of the introduction of compulsory training for all doctors and all panel members in domestic abuse and coercive control, following amendments tabled by the member for Lowestoft, which the Bill Committee unanimously agreed to accept. Amendment 74 ensures that the term domestic abuse in the bill has the same meaning as in the Domestic Abuse Act 2021, which clarifies the definition of domestic abuse and ensures the term is consistent with existing legislation. This provides for a very broad definition to capture a full range of behaviours, including physical or sexual abuse, violent or threatening behaviour, controlling or coercive behaviour, economic abuse, psychological, emotional or other abuse. And it doesn't matter whether that behaviour consists of a single incident or a course of conduct. These are really important amendments addressing concerns around coercion and providing additional layers of safeguarding within the bill. And as such, I hope colleagues can support them. Amendment 60 makes provision corresponding to the provision in clause 12 about the death or illness of a doctor from whom a second opinion is sought for a further referral to be made where, before reporting, the independent doctor dies or through illness or is unwilling or unable to act. This amendment once again ensures continuity of care and is an important detail to add to the bill. Amendments 67 and 68 clarify the provision of this clause in cases where an approved substance requires administration via a medical device. The current drafting of clause 23 is not clear about whether it is allowable to administer the approved substance via a device, which it is. This amendment provides clarity for clinicians. Mr Speaker, Amendment 91 expands the duty as to what must be included in the final statements of patients accessing assisted dying services. It includes additional information to be collected, including whether the person has a disability other than a disability consisting of the illness or disease which caused the person to be terminally ill. Data collection and analysis is an important part of the robust monitoring and reporting built into the bill. Mr Speaker, Amendments 78 and 79 relate to the decisions of the multidisciplinary voluntary assisted dying panels as set out in Schedule 2 of the bill, an important change made at Bill Committee. Each panel comprises of a legal expert, social worker and psychiatrist. Amendment 78 ensures that all... Of course I will.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. The Royal College of Psychiatrists have stated that they do not feel at the moment in time there are sufficient psychiatrists who would be able to deliver that position on such a panel. What response does the member have to that?
I thank the honourable member for giving way, and the Royal College of Psychiatrists have a neutral position on the issue of assisted dying. If we refer to the impact... Yes, they do. If we refer to, I'll just finish this point. If we refer to the impact assessment, the numbers of people who access assisted dying in the first few years will be very small. I think there are around 4,500 psychiatrists in the country, but there's also a period of time, again, to do the training that's required for those psychiatrists who will be taking part in the process of a number of years. So I wouldn't anticipate any problems there. Mr Speaker, I'm going to just keep going if I may, because I think I've been fairly fair. Amendment 78, which I was just about to speak to, ensures that all three members of the panel must agree before a certificate of eligibility is issued, so abstentions cannot result in approval. This amendment came about as a result of discussions at Bill Committee, and it's really important to clarify that when the panel of experts are doing their work, their decision must be unanimous in order for a certificate of eligibility to be granted and for the patient to proceed. If a panel member abstains, no certificate of eligibility can be granted to the person. Schedule 2 also sets out that the panel must give reasons for its decision in each case, and this is really important. And Amendment 79 ensures that those reasons, the reasons of the panel's decision, are communicated in writing in a document to the person to whom the referral in question relates, to the coordinating doctor and to the Commissioner. This creates clear channels of communication and will enable those people to fully understand the expert panel's decisions.
Will the member take an intervention?
I'm going to just finish, if I may, because I think other people want to speak. I now turn to Amendment 14 in this group, tabled by the member for Bradford West, another outstanding member of the Bill Committee. And this amendment states that a person who would not otherwise meet the requirements of subsection 1 shall not be considered to meet those requirements solely as a result of voluntarily stopping eating or drinking. Mr Speaker, I suspect this amendment has been put forward following lengthy discussions at Bill Committee regarding whether people with anorexia would be eligible for an assisted death under this bill. In my previous career, before becoming an MP, I worked with a number of people with eating disorders, and I'm very aware of the hugely sensitive and complex issues surrounding disordered eating, and particularly anorexia. I also know that this is a personal issue for a number of colleagues across the House as a result of their own experiences. Eating disorders cause huge distress for individuals and their families and loved ones, but with care and with the right treatment, it is possible for people to recover and to go back to leading a full and fulfilling life. It's with that experience, of course I will.
I'm very grateful to the Honourable Lady for giving way on that point. Now, she's absolutely right on eating disorders, but my understanding of the proposed amendment is for those who effectively starve themselves into a position of becoming terminally ill without having an eating disorder. That was the thrust of the amendment. Does the Honourable Lady see that, and how does she intend to respond to it?
I thank you for the intervention, and he does make an important point. It isn't specifically about eating disorders. There is a broader context, and my comments will come on to that. It's with that experience in mind, my own personal experience, and having spoken to many colleagues on this issue, that I said in committee, and I say it again now, that under the bill as it now stands, having anorexia would not qualify a person to be eligible for an assisted death. The bill is clear that a person cannot be considered terminally ill only on the basis of a mental disorder. And Clause 2 makes clear that a person must have an inevitably progressive illness or disease which cannot be reversed by treatment. Anorexia is a serious mental health condition which is not inevitably progressive and can thankfully be reversed by treatment. And of course, at every stage of the assisted dying process, the patient must be found to have capacity to make the decision. This is checked repeatedly throughout the process. Not only would someone with severe anorexia be highly unlikely to be assessed to have capacity to make a decision about assisted dying, the other tragic reality is that if a patient was so ill as a result of not eating and drinking for whatever reason, they would die before the process of assisted dying would be able to take place, as it could take up to I'll just finish the point if I may. As it could take up to 2 months to complete all the stages of the assisted dying process as set out in the bill. And the latest clinical guidance states that the general range of survival once voluntary stopping of eating and drinking has begun is between 7 and 21 days. Stopping eating and drinking also leads to a range of symptoms which would make meaningful conversations as required by the bill impossible. However, Mr Speaker, having said this, I know that some people have expressed concerns that the severe physical consequences of a decision to stop eating or drinking could still enable someone to claim eligibility for assisted dying when otherwise they would not be able to do so. And I believe that is the motivation behind this amendment. I'll take one final.
Right. Very kind. Thank you. Obviously, the woman's outlining the case for those who have problems with their eating and they're on diets, and then they become almost to the point where they're unable to make decisions. The Honourable Lady's outlining what's going to happen here. What would the Honourable Lady say in relation to Belgium, where they have legalised the assisted dying for those who have problems with their eating disorders, and same in Canada? So the progression goes away from where the Honourable Lady has said and goes away beyond that, because the world has proved that in other countries.
Yeah, I thank the honourable member for his intervention. The eligibility criteria within this bill are very different to the jurisdictions which he'd mentioned, and people with mental health conditions are not eligible for assisted dying under the provisions of this bill.
The member take an intervention?
I'm just going to finish this point, if I may, because it is actually a very important point. So I acknowledge the concerns that colleagues have expressed around this issue, and I believe that that is the motivation behind this amendment. And as I've set out, I think that risk is negligible. And having taken advice, there is some concern that clinicians might have difficulty in assessing with certainty that the decision to stop eating and drinking was the only reason for a person's terminal prognosis. As such, it might be that some further drafting changes may be required in the other place if this amendment is to pass. But with that in mind, and to ensure that no matter how small the reality is, of there being any sort of loophole, I am happy to support this amendment today.
Intervention?
Mr Speaker, I'm conscious I'm going to leave it for now, if I may. Mr Speaker, I'm very conscious that there are many colleagues who wish to speak in this important debate, and I'm keen to hear their contributions, so I will conclude my remarks there. I thank colleagues for listening, and I hope they're able to support the amendments in my name today, in the interest of strengthening the workability of the bill and providing greater flexibility and safeguards for patients and professionals. Thank you.
Yeah. No obligation to provide assistance, etc.
The question is that new clause 10 be read a second time. Rebecca Paul.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. It is a privilege to speak in this place on such an important bill, after having been part of the committee that scrutinised it line by line and on some occasions word by word for several months earlier this year. It is a pleasure to see so many of my colleagues from Committee Room 10 in here today, a reunion of sorts, and I'm here, as always, with the intention of improving the bill so that if it does indeed pass, vulnerable people are as protected as they can possibly be from unintended consequences. It's important to remember that during this stage and third reading, we are not voting on whether we agree or not with the principle of assisting someone to end their own life. Our role is to vote on the law in front of us, whether the words on the page are clear and do what is intended, whether the statutory process is safe, and whether ultimately the provision of assisted dying benefits our communities. I am one of those people who is not against assisted dying in principle, but I am against this bill. And I'm happy to put on the record now that I have no personal religious beliefs. I'm against it for this simple reason. It will harm far more people than it will help. And those people that will be harmed are the most vulnerable in our communities. And I'm not willing to accept this collateral damage. So today is important as we have the opportunity to improve the safeguards in the bill, so that some of these groups are better protected. And I urge members to take that opportunity to the full. It requires very little skill to draft law that works for 90% of cases, but there is much skill in ensuring that the other 10% is catered for as well. I urge everyone to set their standards to the highest today and think about how we can ensure those unordinary and unexpected cases are adequately protected too. It really is life and death. So please don't accept anything that isn't good enough. I will, of course, give way.
I thank my honourable friend for giving way. Would she agree with me that one of the greatest risks in this bill is around coercion? Yeah. And it's not just coercion from family members or friends, but societal coercion and circumstances. And the current state of palliative care in our country is one of the worst in the developed world. And without adequate palliative care, patients might feel the pressure to go down the assisted dying route instead of seeking adequate care.
I thank the honourable gentleman for that intervention, and I wholeheartedly agree. Mr Speaker, there is much to discuss today and little time, so I will start at the beginning of the bill at the point where criteria for eligibility for an assisted death is set. It is here where important safeguards are needed to ensure those who should never be eligible are excluded. We should not make the mistake of assuming that a doctor will always make the right decision or that they are infallible. It is incumbent upon us to put in place law that makes it harder for them to get it wrong, that makes it harder for someone vulnerable to fall between the cracks. I will, of course, give way.
I'm very grateful to her for giving way, and she just agreed with the point made by the honourable gentleman. It's exactly the same point that was made back in 2016 when this House voted against it. Would she say that the following 9 years after voting against the bill saw a golden age in palliative care as a result of voting against that bill? Or does she think actually if we wait for palliative care to be perfect, we might actually once again never vote in favour of assisted dying?
I thank the honourable gentleman for that intervention, and the evidence is clear that palliative care does not get better when you introduce assisted dying. We saw that in the Bill Committee, and we absolutely should be looking to address palliative care because that will benefit more people. And I will come to that in my speech, so I won't discuss any further as I don't want to get ahead of myself. And there are many helpful amendments in this vein, namely new clause 16, new clause 9, amendment 80, amendment 14, amendment 38, amendment 81, amendment 24, amendment 30 and amendment 31. In simple terms, these amendments seek to tighten and refine the eligibility criteria for an assisted death by setting out when an assisted death should be allowed and for what reasons. and ensuring that those who are vulnerable are protected from something that may not be in their best interests. Interestingly, at the time of second reading, the argument being put forward for an assisted death was to spare those who were dying from unbearable pain. This is an argument that everyone understands and has full sympathy with. No one in this place wants people to endure pain as they come to the end of their life. I certainly wouldn't want that for my loved ones or indeed for myself when my time comes. But then the arguments put forward changed. There was less emphasis on pain and more on choice and autonomy. The word autonomy came up again and again in the Bill Committee. And autonomy is important, of course, but up to a point. We have moved from a proposal to provide a humane end to someone's pain when it can't be relieved in the last months of their life, to providing an assisted death service to those who choose it for any reason, even if the pain can be alleviated by palliative care. But this approach comes with a cost to others, family, clinicians and broader society. This really is momentous. There is no going back from such a massive shift. A move to autonomy, trumping everything else, changes everything. And that is why I have tabled amendments. I will give way to my
extremely grateful to Senator giving way, and that is why her new clause 16 is so important. Because in other jurisdictions who have passed laws like this, up to a third of people, 1/3, report that they've taken this step because they feel they're a burden on others. That's the truth of it. It's not always about pain, and that's the kind of autonomy which leads to disaster.
I thank my honourable friend for making that point, and he is, of course, absolutely right. And that is why I have tabled Amendment 80, to bring this bill back to its original origins and intentions. My amendment requires that in order to be eligible for an assisted death, the pain and discomfort experienced or expected from the terminal illness cannot be reasonably relieved to the person's satisfaction through palliative care. This amendment seeks to limit assisted death to the very small group of people that may benefit from it, not the larger group that actually just needs adequate palliative care to give them the comfortable, dignified death they deserve. I will, of course, give way.
Thank you very much for giving way. The amendment that the member speaks to is put down speaks to severe pain and discomfort. And there's a reason why the medical profession haven't gone for that. How do you propose that we assess severe pain and discomfort as opposed to medium pain? How is a fungating wound part of severe pain or discomfort?
I thank the honourable gentleman for that intervention. I think really the key point here is that we need to be improving palliative care. That's really what we need to be doing here. But we spend so much time and effort on introducing and focusing on this rather than doing the thing that would actually help more people in this country. And my amendment, in combination with my honourable friend for Runnymede and Weybridge's amendments 30 and 31, would drive significant improvements to palliative and end-of-life care, getting us closer to consistent and universally available care for all. I will, of course, give...
I thank the honourable lady for giving way. And just to speak in support of her amendment, because it is, as the Royal College of Psychiatry pointed out, that pain from unresolved physical symptoms can actually make a person want to die. That fear of physical pain or death, often depression is missed, and it's also associated with wish to die. So will the honourable lady agree with me that it's absolutely vital that people are supported to be as free from pain and by having access to good palliative and end-of-life care, and that this provision is only available to those for whom it cannot help?
Yep. I thank the honourable lady for that point, and I do completely concur with the point she's making. The current... I will, of course, give way.
Can I commend the honourable lady for bringing this forward? She's absolutely right to do this. The rejection of amendments to protect palliative care and hospices to facilitate assisted suicide services on the premises for ethical or practical reasons, that bill leaves hospices with little choice but to comply. It also puts him in a very, very difficult position when it comes to funding, and also then it means that the hospices have to provide a staff member to do this work. The issue for and the problems that it creates for palliative care and for hospitals cannot be ignored, and this bill goes against that right in its totality.
I thank the honourable gentleman for that point, and I agree, and I will be coming on to that in more detail in the second half of my speech. I will, of course, give way.
I thank my honourable friend for giving way. And with regard to these amendments, we are so blessed to have our precious NHS. And at vital stages, quite rightly, the NHS delivers care in obstetrics, gynaecology, neonatology and paediatrics. But at the end of life, around 70% of care is delivered outside of the NHS, largely by charities. And that figure, Mr. Speaker, is even higher for children's palliative and hospice care. So the state pays for how we enter this life, but not for how we depart. There is something deeply wrong about that for our society. So does my honourable friend agree that surely we must address that issue first and address the delivery of universal palliative and hospice care before we go anywhere near this assisted dying bill?
I thank my honourable friend for that very good point, and I agree. In the interest of time, I'm now going to progress. The current situation we have now, where fully funded palliative and end-of-life care is not available in certain postcodes, means those unfortunate patients do not have a real choice. We know that 25% of the people who die in this country do not have the palliative care they need. That is more than 100,000 people a year. And if this bill goes through, they will now be offered a fully funded assisted death as the only reliable way to end their pain. That is no choice. But I urge members who want to see improvements in palliative and end-of-life care to vote in support of my Amendment 80 and Spencer 30 and 31 if they are pushed to a vote. I won't, because I've not got much time. I now want to move on, Mr. Speaker, to the lack of the best interest test in this bill, which is what my new Clause 16 seeks to remedy. Patient autonomy is, of course, important, but it must be balanced against what is in someone's best interest. So in certain situations, when it's in the best interest of a patient, treatment can be given against a patient's will. For example, force-feeding a young girl with anorexia. This isn't an easy balance to get right, but currently, in the absence of any best interest test in this bill, following the process rigidly will lead to devastating results in some cases. The current bill prioritises autonomy of the patient in a specific moment of time, rather than what might be in their best interest in the long run. It makes no allowance for the fact someone may feel a certain way temporarily due to other considerations. For example, when someone has just received a terminal diagnosis that can be understandably cause a depressive state and suicidal feelings. But those feelings don't necessarily last, so it may be in the best interest of the patient to allow a little time to pass, give a little breathing space before considering the assisted death route. I have tabled new Clause 16, which essentially tries to provide this best interest test by excluding certain reasons that may be driving a patient's decision rather than alleviation of pain. For example, we have heard a great deal about the internal pressure from patients themselves driven by concerns of being a burden. And we heard clearly in Bill Committee that a patient can tell a doctor that they are only wanting an assisted death for financial reasons and they will still be approved. We know from overseas territories that often patients will opt for it because of social and welfare issues, such as being homeless. I'm sorry, I don't have much time and I do wish to progress and get through my points. How can we be happy with a process that doesn't exclude such reasons? Instead of providing the support actually needed, the state is content to put them on a pathway that leads to their death. I hope this House will recognise that whether you support assisted dying in principle or not, it's morally bankrupt to not have some kind of best interest test to protect those who aren't seeking death to alleviate pain from a terminal illness. Another group that is particularly vulnerable is those with eating disorders. In Chelsea Roth's oral evidence, she set out that at least 60 people around the world have been euthanised or assisted in suicide, with anorexia nervosa listed by name as a terminal condition. To paraphrase her, these were young women who were not terminally ill and had decades of life ahead of them. It's important to make the point that someone suffering... I would love to give way, but
The honourable lady said she's not... Please, just... The honourable lady said she's not giving way. The thing is, we're aiming for 15 minutes. It's going to be 20 if we don't pick up. Rebecca Paul.
I do apologise, but I do want to get through my speech. It's important to make the point that someone suffering with anorexia, or indeed any mental condition, is not intended to be eligible for an assisted death. However, in the case of anorexia, there are physical manifestations of the illness, such as malnutrition and diabetes, that might mean the patient meets the definition of being terminally ill. And that is the nub of the problem here. The bill doesn't adequately rule out physical manifestations caused by mental illness. That's why the Honourable Member for West Bradford's Amendment 14 is so important. It ensures that anyone who voluntarily stops eating or drinking isn't eligible for assisted dying. I support this amendment strongly as it addresses a big risk. And lastly, on eligibility specifically, I want to talk about capacity. There are such problems with the current approach to determining capacity that I barely know where to start. When it comes to ending one's own life, there should be a higher standard applied. The current definition of capacity was not created with such a monumental decision in mind, and if this were being drafted from scratch today, it would look very different. This is one of the reasons the Royal College of Psychiatry does not support this bill. Under this bill, a person is assumed to have capacity in the first instance. A clinician only needs to be over 50% sure that a person has capacity. If that person is making unwise decisions, that is not taken into account. And a person can be helped to make a decision, for example, when a patient has learning disabilities. So I ask you all today, are you happy with that? Does that sound like a robust approach to assessing whether someone has capacity to make the decision to end their own life? Let's begin with the starting presumption of capacity. This is too lax a standard for assisted death decisions. I therefore support the Honourable Member Bexley-Heath and Crayford's Amendment 24, which disapplies a specific piece of the Mental Capacity Act for the purposes of assisted dying. And one of the biggest issues for me is the fact that the current approach requires an impairment of or a disturbance of the brain for someone to be considered to not have capacity, irrespective of whether they can make a decision. So in the real world, Mr. Speaker, what this means is that a doctor could assess a patient who gives the impression of being confused, illogical, erratic, inconsistent. Everything about them could scream they're not in a good place to make this decision at that point in time. But they will still be considered to have capacity if there's no identifiable impairment or disturbance of the mind or brain. This potentially puts those with depression, anxiety, learning disabilities, eating disorders, or even those just experiencing physical pain that's driving them to distraction in danger of being considered to have capacity when they do not. Right, so far I've focused on eligibility. I'm now going to talk about hospices. Hospices and my amendments to them.
Sorry, please. I really do want to get many people in. Please, if we can come to a conclusion, would be very helpful.
That's great. Just wind up. Just wind up.
Okay.
Just wind up.
I therefore wish to talk in support of some of my amendments, specifically that support new clause 17 and new clause 18 in my name provide important protections for hospices that are currently lacking in the bill. New clause 18 makes it crystal clear that any regulated care home or hospice can decide whether or not to provide assisted dying on their premises. And new clause 17 makes it clear that they cannot be subject to any detriment for not providing or permitting assisted deaths, and that their public funding cannot be conditional upon them providing this service. Mr. Speaker, whether you're in favour of assisted dying or not, we must preserve the rights of organisations, companies and charities to choose whether to offer it. They must never be forced into it by public funding being conditional upon the provision of assisted dying. I note new clause 10 tabled by the Honourable Member for Spen Valley, as it expands the protections for individuals to not participate in the assisted dying process if they so wish. This new clause seeks to protect employees from being subjected to any detriment for either participating or not participating in the provision of assisted dying. This is a sensible protection and ensures that if an NHS hospital is providing an assisted death service, that any member of staff doesn't want to participate does not have to and won't suffer any detriment for that. However, there needs to be a sensible mechanism balancing this against the employer's right to set their own policy on assisted dying, and that is what my Amendment 10AC seeks to do, but we've already talked about that, so I won't go over that again. Right. I did want to talk about process and family, but it looks like I'm not going to have time to do that. So, Mr. Speaker, I will end there. I thank you for your patience and generosity in time, and I'm grateful that I've had a chance to speak in support of the amendments. And I look forward to hearing from other members today.
Dave Beghillier.
To particularly talk about new clause 1 and new clause 2 in my name and consequential amendment number 2 and others which I'll touch on at the end. But these are, I would say, Mr. Speaker, and I'm not being at all dismissive of those who've helped me draft these amendments, but they are imperfect amendments. Those of us who are not the sponsor have not had the support of government drafters in tidying up this bill, and we need to acknowledge that the bill in front of us today is the bill, more or less, that will or will not be passed by this House. That any amendments made do not get, will have then, at the point of third reading, and that is it. There will be no further opportunity to redraft them. And sadly, one of these in particular was rejected in committee. And we know that if those changes had been discussed before the publication of the original bill, or even in evidence before the Bill Committee, we would have been in a better place to get that tighter drafting that you do need in making good legislation. We are not a debating society, we are now legislating for a law that would enable the state to assist in people taking their lives. So I'm sad that we're only able to discuss these now. I didn't have the opportunity myself to be on the Bill Committee, but I do commend all members who spent so many hours discussing and debating those issues. But the ramifications for the clauses I want to talk about are very important for potential users of a service to be created, for medical professionals, for families and for other health professionals. The bill currently allows doctors to suggest assisted dying to a patient who has not raised it themselves. This, I believe, and I know many others do, presents a serious risk that terminally ill patients, already highly vulnerable, will feel pressured to end their lives. I'll give way to the Honourable.
I thank the Honourable Lady for giving way, and I realise this comes from a very good place, this amendment, but can she not see that this amendment is actually inconsistent with our ethical obligations as doctors? And that's why the BMA have suggested that there should be no duty to raise this issue, but nor should there be a ban on doing so. And what I also ask her to consider that Victoria in Australia did have this as part of their bill initially, a so-called gagging clause, and they had to remove it because it caused confusion and was detrimental to patient care. So should we not learn from what has happened? Thank you.
I thank the honourable gentleman for his point, and it brings me to a point I do really want to address. As I said right in my opening remarks, these are imperfect amendments. I have had, and I'll get into some of the conversations I've had with a number of people about this, but I'm one person. I have not been able to consult as a government or a sponsor could consult with the BMA, and I'm aware of their concerns. But we are talking here about decisions around life and death, a very definite and irreversible decision. So absolutely, and I have I know many doctors have had conversations, but not in the level that we would need to do to legislate on this, because this is, I think, a different set of circumstances, and I very much appreciate the point. I give way to my
Does she agree with me that there are far too many people who do not have confidence in the face of authority? And if a doctor raises assisted suicide with them, however tactfully or professionally, they will feel that they are being steered in that direction.
I thank my right honourable friend for that, and her many years of experience as a constituency MP in the same borough as me. We know many of those vulnerable people. And Dr. Rachel Clark, a hospital palliative care doctor, said if, for instance, you say to a vulnerable patient who has just been told they have a diagnosis of terminal cancer, have you thought about assisted dying? I would suggest that I, being Dr. Rachel Clark, that stating it broadly like that is a form of pressure and that you are potentially unintentionally coercing that patient. So we are in a very difficult space, as my honourable friend highlighted, as with his background as a practising GP. We recognise that, and as I said, Mr. Speaker, this is an imperfect process to deal with that challenge, but it is a very different set of circumstances compared with other improvised advice that the doctor gives way. Talking of doctors, I give way to the honourable.
I thank the right honourable lady for giving way, and I rise to support her new clause 1, because I'm very aware, as a doctor myself, of the trust that the public place in doctors and the seriousness with which they take what we say. And if a doctor tells somebody that they think or gives them information about assisted dying, it is quite reasonable for that person will think either the doctor is suggesting that they should take part in this process, or even they're hinting that their death is going to be a dreadful one and trying to be kind to them. And if doctors are able to say that this is a good process, more people will take it up than would otherwise have wanted to.
I thank the honourable lady. I need to get into some of my arguments. I have two clauses in particular to talk about, so I'm not going to take any more interventions for the time being. But I do believe this presents a really serious risk that terminally ill patients, already vulnerable, And already, we know of examples, it's not the debate to make those points about examples of patients who have felt very suicidal, very low at the point of diagnosis. At that point, they're very vulnerable, but often with good care and good pain relief can move away from that decision, but they could feel pressured into ending their lives sooner than they wish to, rather than and also the burden issues around family. And I need to make some progress. And I also want to talk about the issue of how the teenage brain works. This bill would apply to a child, to a young person at the age of 18, and a month or so after they reach that date of that birth date, after they reach that date, they could undertake an assisted death. And I want to talk a bit. I've had some very good conversations, and I'm going to highlight some of the people who've generously given of their time in enabling me to talk about some of these important issues that I am very worried have not been discussed at any point in the bill, except for that moment in Bill Committee where there was a short and important discussion, but nevertheless short. And I just wonder, if I can finish my point particularly about the issue of the age of doctors before I move on to the issue around 18-year-olds. Dr. Alexandra Mullock, who's a senior lecturer in medical law and co-director of the Centre for Social Ethics and Policy at the University of Manchester, said in written evidence to the Bill Committee, so it was provided to the Bill Committee, the freedom for a registered medical practitioner to raise or discuss the option of seeking to die in clause 4.2 is ethically problematic. And she also highlighted that professional advice regarding treatment will be received by the patient as a recommendation, as the Honourable Lady just said, and that is a really big concern. And I just highlight one point from the UK Coalition for Deaf and Disabled People, who are very concerned and would like this removed as well. I give way to the Honourable Gentleman.
An excellent point. Does she also acknowledge that, given what we are beginning to know about coercive control, that the suggestion by a doctor, innocently, maybe neutrally, that this could be an option, could be latched onto by one who is coercively controlling someone who may choose assisted dying, and we will never find out until after that person's death, if at all, that that had been the case?
One does highlight an important point in relation to my amendments and others. But in this House, we have made coercive control an illegal thing. This was ruled on in legislation only in recent years, and yet this is such a big issue on an irreversible decision, and that is what is particularly different about this bill, and therefore why some positions are particularly challenging, because we're talking about irreversible decisions. But I want, Mr. Speaker, to talk a bit about how the teenage brain works. Children and young people are particularly susceptible to being influenced, including into dangerous and risky behaviour. And in a number of countries, assisted dying laws have been expanded to allow children and young people to end their lives. And we need to be very alert to that very real risk. And I'm impressed by the work of the Children's Commissioner, who recently published a report into children's views on assisted dying. And it was very heart-wrenching to read. Those with illnesses and disabilities were particularly concerned about what this bill means for them. These children haven't really had a voice in this debate so far. And there is talk about whether this may apply to children with life-limiting or severe progressive diseases. I'll give way to the Honourable Lady.
I thank the Honourable Lady for giving way, and indeed I also have great concerns about our young people. I was at an event in my constituency of Lagan Valley the other night, and it said that almost all of our young people across the UK are having their mental health impacted by social media. If we throw this into the mix, this has the potential to do untold damage. And I applaud everybody who has put the time to this today. I do have to say I do not support this, but I do applaud everybody, regardless of their view, in trying to make this better. But I have seriously grave concerns about the ramifications of this.
I thank the Honourable Lady for her comment. I'm going to touch, if I have time, on some of those social media impacts. But I do want to lay on the record my thanks to just some of the professionals who gave of their time to speak to me in preparation for this amendment. Sophie Scott is the Professor of Cognitive Neuroscience. Not the moment now, please. No. Sophie Scott is the Professor of Cognitive Neuroscience at University College London. Sally Baxendale, the Professor of Clinical Neuropsychology at UCL. Sarah Jane Blackmore, Professor of Psychology and Cognitive Neuroscience at the University of Cambridge. Dr Richard Hayne, Consultant and Clinical Lead, All Wales Managed Clinical Network in Paediatric Palliative Medicine at Cardiff and the Vale University Health Board, and Dr. Anna Karina Anderson, consultant in paediatric palliative medicine and medical director for Shooting Star Children's Hospice. I've had some very interesting conversations, and I'm only very sad, Madam Deputy Speaker, that this hasn't been a bigger debate as part of this, because the process hasn't allowed for that. And in the time I've got, I'm afraid, I apologise to them in advance that I will not be able to do justice to the very many and careful and thoughtful points that they raised. But I think it's important for the House to have an understanding of, I've said no, I need to get on to this. In the time I've got to explain and give due credit to the people who've assisted me in raising these issues. Adolescent brains develop differently. From the age of puberty, there's a very rapid change in how young people make decisions. And as adults, we have experience to imagine what a future might look like. But younger people, up to about the age of 25, often can't plan or predict futures, and because that part of the brain has not developed well. And they're not good at understanding regret. And the comparisons here are different for adults. Role models and social groups matter a great deal. I'll give way to the Honourable Lady.
Thank you very much. I fully appreciate the Honourable Lady giving way and the time constraints, but I wonder if she would acknowledge that for many of us, the concern with, first of all, not telling patients with all the options, and particularly with young people who are now so socially media literate, and the automatic reaction is to go and Google everything. In fact, we all do it. That the danger is, if they are not told all the options, if they are not given the guidance that's available, then they will go to Google, and what we will see is yet more of the dangerous suicide attempt that we see at the moment.
Well, I think the Honourable Lady made some points that I haven't got time to completely unpick, but I would simply say that to have something positively suggested, if you'll let me complete my argument, is a big issue for young people. And I think the social media aspect is an important one. But role models, the social network matters. At that point of puberty, teenagers particularly will look to their social group, which will massively influence their behaviour in a way that their family don't so much. And adolescents are more likely to take risks. Their neurodevelopment underpinnings are different, and the pathways between the rational and the emotional parts of the brain are not fully developed. And in a hot situation where there's a lot of emotion, they take more risk, and particularly because they don't have the ability to think about the counterfactual. And the counterfactual in this case is not being here anymore. It's a very difficult thing for a lot of people to understand, but particularly for young people. Their ability to think flexibly and change their mind is in the front of the brain, and that doesn't always doesn't react to the sorry, I'm trying to speak at such pace, Madam Deputy Speaker. I need to make some progress. Teenagers are passionate about their beliefs, and peers can change their mind in a way that often their parents can't. There's not always a logical decision-making path. A doctor would carry weight, and if the child may be thinking about it, and that somebody, that doctor, that professional, could make their decision a legitimate option, and that in response to the Honourable Lady from Edinburgh's point. There are very many issues in palliative care. We talk about Gillick competency. So just to be clear, that under the age of 18, young people can make own decisions about healthcare. Can they make their own decisions? They can make their own decisions about healthcare. And under the age of 16 even, you can have that conversation because of Gillick competency, which is a good principle. But the capacity and mental capacity and the issues around Gillick competency are often not well put in place. As some of the palliative care, I've said no to the Honourable Lady. The law itself is ambiguous about Gillick competency. We've moved on from the point she was trying to raise. Capacity in the Mental Capacity Act and Gillick competency, they triangulate through the person but also the condition. So it's not just a question it relates to the complexity of the condition, but also to the individual. Peer pressure, therefore, is a very big part of what has an impact on people, but also that view of the professional doctor. On that point, very brief. Sorry, I need to make some progress, and I need to move on. I just wanted to. I wanted to touch, Madam Deputy Speaker, on this issue about children making a decision at the age of 18. So you can have a conversation with someone about this, and then on the 18th, on your 18th birthday, sign on the dotted line. You would need another conversation at that point. But I think we need to understand that even at the age of 18 and 19, young people's brains are in a different place on this. And we are saying, if we pass this bill, that at the age of 18, 19, 20, you could have an assisted death. We need to understand the ramifications of that for the people who could have that in play. And I wanted to make sure that I'm covering some of the other points that other members have laid. I won't go through all the amendments that play into this, but I do think that strengthening the panel, the safeguards, the other amendments down to do that, which I haven't got time to list, and the coercion and capacity issues, which many members have raised, are very, very important in this regard. But there hasn't been the time to work through how these issues have an impact on younger people. If only I had time to go into some of the evidence I had, and I've given it, I'm afraid to say, only just a very hasty run-through because of the needs of time on this day, which is a sign, Madam Deputy Speaker, I think, of the challenges of this process, that we haven't got time to go into the detail that we need to do. But socialisation is important, so social media has a very big impact, and we need to understand that that will have an impact on young people making their decisions. I'm just trying to do the maths on my timing. Madam Deputy Speaker, I fear I have run out of time. I would like to speak for longer, but I'm getting the mood of the House and the mood of the Chair that you do not wish us to do that. I am very concerned about this not being properly discussed. And I would just again remind members, if we vote on this bill, these matters have not been fully tested with the professions concerned, as we've heard from the Royal College of Psychiatrists this week, and from many of the others that would need to have to grapple with this in practical terms. And that's what we're doing now, is legislating for the real practice of delivering this. And we have not had time to explore this fully.
Can I remind members that we currently have a 15-minute guide for speeches, so please do help each other so as many members can speak as possible. And I call Dr Neil Hurst-Shastra.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. This House is now faced with a responsibility as profound as it is complex, to ensure that this bill remains clear in its purpose, cautious in its application and compassionate in its impact. That purpose is simple yet solemn: to grant adults of sound mind with a terminal diagnosis the legal right to seek assistance to end their lives in carefully regulated circumstances, through a legal framework where compassion and control coexist. With that in mind, I rise to speak against a series of new clauses 1, 2 and 9, which, whilst no doubt well-intentioned, threaten to confuse, dilute or duplicate what is already a well-constructed piece of legislation. And let me begin, Madam Deputy Speaker, with new clauses 1 and 2. New clause 1 seeks to prohibit healthcare professionals from raising the topic of assisted dying unless first broached by the patient. Now, while superficially this may be appealing as a safeguard, it represents a fundamental misunderstanding of the doctor-patient relationship. We trust our clinicians every day to raise subjects of great complexity and moral weight. I will give way.
You agree with me then that, Freds, unfortunately, for some of our constituents up and down the country, they don't trust our clinicians. They have grave concerns about the way that they are treated because they feel that they do not have the level of equality within our NHS, which is sadly the case, and it was explained and shown during COVID.
I'm grateful to the honourable member for that intervention. I fear there is some rhetoric that engenders a fear around the medical profession that is misplaced. Those are not my experiences from clinical practice, nor of those of family members. I will give way in a moment, if I may. Those are not my experience in clinical practice or those of my family members who have worked in it. We must trust our medical professionals, who are highly trained and capable individuals, to have these difficult and complex conversations that they do every day on issues such as aggressive chemotherapy or the withdrawal of ventilation. I will give way to the honourable member first.
Thank you. Like myself, the honourable member sat on the Bill Committee, and he heard, like I did, that if you have a learning disability, you are 5 times more likely to have a do not resuscitate order placed on you during the pandemic. So did he hear that evidence, and why did he not therefore agree with it?
I'm grateful to the honourable gentleman for his intervention. These are complex conversations that take place up and down the country every day. We know they're taking place in St Thomas's at this moment. We are treating our medical professionals as though they don't take their professional obligations seriously. We must recognise the expertise that they bring and the sensitivities in which they have these conversations. I will give way.
I wonder if the honourable gentleman has the experience, as I do, and as the relatives of many disabled people up and down this country have, of having to fight the medical profession to get the attention, and the worth that your loved one deserves when the medical profession is not listening to you and to what your loved one needs, because that is the experience of many people up and down this country.
I'm grateful to the honourable lady for her intervention, and I commend those family members who are really powerful advocates for their children, their parents, their relatives in this engagement with the medical profession. But we are at real danger of treating our clinicians as though they have no care for their patients, as though they don't realise. I will give way.
I thank the honourable member for giving way on that point. A simple point to make is, I'm sure all of us in this place respect and value our medical professionals. The simple point is, though, that not everyone that goes before a medical profession has the same experience, the same confidence as some of us do in this place.
I'm grateful to the honourable gentleman for his intervention, and this is why it is so important that we have the rigorous training and safeguards that are a fundamental part of this bill. I'm going to make some progress, if I may, because the point is, on this issue, you cannot have a fully informed discussion. You cannot weigh up the balances of the decision being made if you don't know the full options available to you. That is a part of informed consent. In respect to new clause 2, I'm going to make a little progress, if I may. In respect of new clause 2, those who have had the privilege of meeting a young person living with a terminal illness will know that they often display a maturity and a depth of understanding far beyond their years. To deny them the opportunity for a considered conversation about their future upon reaching adulthood is not an act of compassion, in my view. It is to abandon them. It is to leave them isolated, navigating a complex and deeply personal journey through the filter of online forums, rather than in dialogue with trusted, qualified professionals. And we owe them better than that, Madam Deputy Speaker. I will give way.
The honourable gentleman for giving way. And would he agree with me that my constituent Noah, at 16, who was diagnosed with an inoperable brain tumour, and who has said he'd like the right to choose, and I quote, "The thought of being locked in, unable to communicate, is not how I want to spend the last months of my life. To end my life on my terms when the time comes would give me comfort." And so Noah doesn't want to be infantilised. He wants to be treated like the adult he is. So would he not agree with me that this bill will give him that protection?
I'm grateful to the honourable lady for her intervention, and it's a very powerful personal story of Noah, who I think reflects the maturity of many young people when dealing with these challenging issues. New clauses 1 and 2, by imposing, in effect, a statutory gag in this one area, risk infantilising terminally ill patients, creating, in my view, a chilling effect on communication at the very moment when clarity and compassion are most needed. I'm going to make some progress, if I may. If anything, new clauses 1 and 2 may result in harming patients, forcing them to suffer in silence, unaware of lawful options simply because they don't know how to ask. Finally, Madam Deputy Speaker, I want to turn to new clause 9, which, in my view, presents a number of issues. In the first instance, subsection 1 as drafted permits there to be, in effect, 2 different standards of proof. That must be legal nonsense. The boundaries of any legal test or hurdle must be clear. A failure to do so creates a great deal of uncertainty. Furthermore, the proposal to shift the standard of proof from the civil to the criminal, requiring panels to operate on a standard of beyond reasonable doubt, is deeply inappropriate. The balance of probabilities is the cornerstone of medical and civil decision-making. To adopt a criminal threshold risks freezing the entire process, creating a system that is so risk-averse. I will give way.
When we come to new clause 9, we're talking about the occasion when the final potion is delivered to the patient to kill them. Now, we don't deprive people of their liberty without proving something beyond all reasonable doubt. Why should we deprive someone of their life if we're not going to prove it beyond all reasonable doubt that that is their will?
I'm grateful to the honourable and learned gentleman for his intervention. These are individuals who, of course, are making this ultimate choice for themselves. My fear is that this well-intentioned new clause will make the bill so unusable that it will become ineffective. We are not prosecuting a crime here. We are enabling a choice under tightly prescribed circumstances. And whilst I accept, Madam Deputy Speaker, that each of these new clauses in their own way seeks to improve the bill, we must be cautious about layering protections to the point of paralysis. The bill as drafted is not a blank cheque. It contains safeguards, panel oversight and rigorous eligibility criteria. Let us not bury its moral clarity under legal clutter. In defending this legislation, we're not abandoning care, but we're affirming dignity. Let us do so with confidence and reject these amendments.
Point of order.
Point of order, Gregory Stafford.
Madam Deputy Speaker, I'd like your advice on a point of order that Mr. Speaker said there are over 90 people who wish to speak in this debate. We've been debating this for an hour and a half. 4 speakers have made. If we go to 2 o'clock, that would be under 20 speakers. I understand it's the discretion of the chair as to whether a closure motion can be brought. If we haven't got past, let's say, 20 or 30 members speaking in this debate, what indication would she give, if she is still in the chair, whether she would accept a closure motion at that point?
I thank the honourable gentleman for his point of order. I can say we will cross that bridge when we come to it. We currently are asking members to keep their contributions to 15 minutes, and that, of course, will be reassessed very shortly. I can give him assurances there. I now call Annalise Dodds.
Madam Deputy Speaker, I rise to speak in favour of new clause 16 and amendment 14. Madam Deputy Speaker, since I've been in the chamber, I've received some truly awful news that 3 people died last night in a fire in Bicester, including 2 members of the Oxfordshire Fire and Rescue Service. The member for Bicester has had to leave the chamber to liaise with those on the ground. We both want to take this opportunity, if I may, Madam Deputy Speaker, to convey our deep sorrow and solidarity with the families of those who have died, and our fervent and heartfelt best wishes to the 2 firefighters who remain in a serious condition. We're grateful for their heroism and that of their colleagues when, as ever, they ran towards danger to serve us all. Madam Deputy Speaker, as I mentioned, I rise to speak in favour of new clause 16 and amendment 14, and I'm very grateful indeed for the opportunity to speak to these amendments. When this bill first came before the House, I was a minister attending Cabinet, therefore not able to speak on this subject. And I do want to genuinely thank my honourable friend for Spen Valley and every single member in this House who has served for so many hours within the Bill Committee for this incredibly important bill. I also want to thank the hundreds of my constituents who have contacted me with their views on this bill. I genuinely believe that every single one of them was motivated by compassion, by a determination to reduce suffering, and in many cases their views were shaped by their experience of death and of suffering in life. I know that's the case for many of us in this chamber as well, and therefore I hope that same spirit of respect that we saw previously will continue throughout the rest of the passage of this bill, whatever our views may be. As I stated, Madam Deputy Speaker, I want to speak in favour of new clause 16 and amendment 14, and particularly in favour of new clause 16 part 1A, around excluding from the scope of the bill those who do not want to be a burden on others or in public services, and those experiencing a mental disorder, including depression. When it comes to the former, we have obviously already had a discussion, even just this morning, about whether international analogies are indeed appropriate to be mentioned. They will, of course, be instrumentalised by those who have different views about this important subject. I have to say, Madam Deputy Speaker, I personally have found survey evidence from the Oregon example in relation to people expressing that they felt they were a burden to be highly compelling. I do not believe that indicates that was the primary reason why they sought assisted dying, but I do believe that it's an important piece of evidence we need to take into account. I also believe, Madam Deputy Speaker, that we need to look at where situations of people potentially subject to coercion have been evaluated by professionals in our society and where we might be concerned about the outcomes of this. And here, I do want to ask for members' understanding. Happy to give way.
The point she has just raised. So the Oregon example suggests that 47 people in 2023 who opted for assisted dying as one of their primary motivations was that they felt they were a burden to others. Doesn't that cause great concern for everybody here? And doesn't it undermine the argument that to pass this bill on the grounds of autonomy isn't accurate, because it then affects the autonomy of people who will self-coerce?
So I personally believe that it does. Madam Deputy Speaker, I have heard countless times the phrase that I do not want to be a burden. I've heard that time and again. I know members will come to different conclusions about whether that is sufficiently excluded through this bill. I believe it needs to be actually on the face of the bill so that we can ensure that it is not covered by its scope. When it comes to... yes, we'll give way.
I'm very grateful for the Right Honourable Lady giving way. I put forward a proposed amendment to ensure that the that the self-defined responsibility to have assisted dying did not become a rationale. What is her view on the impact of intersectionality on this? We know that a number of people who don't, in practical terms, have full control over their lives. The Right Honourable Lady, the Mother of the House, made the point about people, particularly from ethnic minorities, particularly women from ethnic minorities, who are often pushed around by their families, their wider society, will be particularly at risk from the gentle advice or suggestions from authority figures that they will be overly deferential towards, and in doing so lead them, I think, into a very dangerous position.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I do agree with the Right Honourable Gentleman. I further believe that it is exactly those individuals who would be more likely to be subject to coercion from others, and I'm afraid that the evidence does indicate that. We can see that, sadly, when it comes to the experience of our courts from so-called mercy killings. I appreciate that many members in this chamber would not want that example to be used in the context of this discussion. Of course, we're talking about something very different when it comes to those court cases. Nonetheless, I do believe it's instructive that in those cases we've had highly trained legal professionals who've often described the actions, particularly of former partners, as motivated by compassion. But then, when the circumstances have been investigated in detail, we've seen evidence of substantial amounts of coercion and abuse. I do think it's important we consider that now.
Would she give way on that point?
Yes, I will.
I thank her for giving way. Is she reassured by the fact that within the bill there is a criminal offence created around coercion and pressure, which doesn't exist at the moment? So those victims of domestic abuse, or indeed anybody else, no one is checking for coercion when they take their own lives under desperate circumstances.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I'm very grateful to my honourable friend for making that point. I believe the bill has been substantially improved through the many amendments that she has set out and other members. I know these issues were discussed in detail within the bill committee, but I have to be honest that the prospect of a prosecution sadly often has not been sufficient to prevent abuse. I note that in the discussions within the bill committee there was mention made by a number of medical professionals to the fact that they believe they often are having to assess whether coercion has taken place, that they believe that they are confident in that assessment, but there's a huge amount of contestation around whether that confidence is rightly placed or otherwise. Yeah.
I thank the honourable member for giving way. Does she share my concern that in the new bill, as it's come to the House, where it says there are 3 hours for a panel, and doctors, one doctor and the second doctor, might not actually know the patient or have met the patient, that risk to try and spot that coercion is very limited.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Yes, I do share my honourable friend's concerns in that regard. And of course, very sadly, Madam Deputy Speaker, we all know how perpetrators of coercion operate, how they can often try and school those subject to that coercion in ways to respond to questioning, try and hide what they are doing from others, and therefore I do believe that is a concern. I wish, yes, maybe one last intervention. I want to make progress so others can speak. Thank you.
Can I thank the honourable lady for giving way? Does she not see that during the Bill Committee we actually were very, very aware of coercion, and we actually, one of the reasons we have a social worker on the panel of experts is for this very specific reason, and also there is a clause that says that have made their decision to end their own life voluntarily and have not been coerced or pressured by any other person. So it's very clear in the bill, I would say.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. And I do very much appreciate the effort that my honourable friend went to in ensuring that these matters were covered, and indeed, of course, those of the proposer of the bill. But I regret, because of the types of patterns of behaviour that we see time and again with those who have been subject to coercion, I do not sadly believe those safeguards go far enough. That is my assessment. I know that other members will come to a different view. I will make some progress because I know others wish to speak. I want to please, Madam Deputy Speaker, please speak briefly to the Part 1B of New Clause 16 relating to mental disorder. And I know, again, that colleagues will dispute whether analogies here are appropriate, but I do think it's important the House is aware. I know this was covered in the committee, that in the Netherlands, which of course does have a different regime to that proposed, nonetheless, in 2010, 2 cases involving psychiatric suffering were subject to assisted dying. In 2023, there were 138 cases. A very substantial increase. I do understand that my honourable friend is saying this is a completely different set of circumstances in the Dutch case. But I am concerned, Madam Deputy Speaker, that I believe there is some confusion around the scope of the mental capacity provisions within legislation. We've just heard... yes, happy to give way on that point.
I'm very grateful to the honourable member for giving way. I supported the bill at second reading, but on condition that there was going to be a strengthening of the bill to tackle this precise issue around capacity. Would the honourable member accept that the bill that we see today is very different from the bill we saw at second reading? The requirement for capacity, if there's any doubt at all, a doctor is compelled to report that person for additional assessment. Independent advocates have been introduced for people with learning disabilities, autism or mental disorders. Social workers are now included in a panel of experts. Specific training on mental capacity is required, and there is a disability advisory board as well. Would the honourable member...
Order. Annalise Dodds. Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, and I do agree with her that the bill has improved. But I would state that there is a difference between mental capacity, at least as that is assessed by medical professionals, and the presence of mental disorder. And I know this is a subject that the committee examined at length, but it was very clear from that discussion within the committee that elements which they anticipated would be covered by the mental capacity provisions, such as being able to assess information, being able to make judgments between alternatives, that they would be covered by provisions, but the valuation of those alternatives, which can be impacted by mental disorder, is not part of that process. The reality is, for someone who is subject to a number of different mental disorders, including, for example, sadly, eating disorders, that individual may be highly intelligent. They may well be able to carry out many logical procedures to assess information, but their evaluation of the value of their future life, their assessment of the value of the importance of control, bodily control, related to other factors, is different from that of someone who is not ill. And I believe that issue, Madam Deputy Speaker, has not been fully understood. That's why I will not give way at the moment. That is why, Madam Deputy Speaker, I believe it's important that that exclusion is put very clearly on the face of this bill. I'm happy to give way to my honourable friend.
Will my honourable member agree with me that Clause 2, subsection 3, which makes it very clear that by reason only of either disability or mental disorder, no one will be able to qualify for assistance under this Act, unless they also have 6 months terminality and capacity?
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, and I am aware of what my honourable friend quite rightly refers to. Of course, any such condition would have to be coterminous with a terminal illness, but I would mention in relation to that, first of all, that of course we know, and I know that the committee thrashed this out for a long period of time, we know that very often depression is present at the same time as a diagnosis of terminal illness. We also know, Madam Deputy Speaker, that concepts such as, in inverted commas, terminal anorexia have now started to be used in certain different contexts. That suggests, unfortunately, that even despite the many protestations that have been made by those who understandably support this bill, there is the possibility that we could see those subject to eating disorders being pulled within the scope of this bill. I'm very pleased that that Amendment 14 would rule that out. I think it's important that it does so, and I think it is really critical that this chamber sends that message as well, given potential confusion around its scope that was mentioned earlier. So, Madam Deputy Speaker, again, I'm very grateful for the opportunity to speak to that new clause and to this amendment. And above all, as I said, I hope we can continue this important discussion, which is so critical for so many of our constituents. Thank you.
Father of the House, Sir Edward Lee.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I wish to speak to new clause 16 and 17, and I think that rather than give my own views, powerful testimony on behalf of someone who actually runs a care home should be heard by the House. And I want to quote as briefly as possible from Dan Hayes, who runs the Orders of St John Care Trust that run care homes in Lincolnshire generally and in my constituency. We believe that the bill as drafted is flawed and the risks to older, vulnerable people residing with social care environments are substantial. We believe that any assumption by those drafting the final legislation that it is not intended for use by those living with conditions regarded as part of the ageing process would be mistaken. Any legislation would be immediately tested and assumed to be accessible to such a cohort of people. To that end, we believe that in order to provide the necessary protections to such a vulnerable part of our society, the bill must be explicit in its reference to older people living in residential services. And that is why these new clauses are so important, Madam Deputy Speaker. The bill must take account of the current unfairness and instability at the heart of our social care system and question whether such legislation can be introduced while such problems exist. The bill must recognise an individual's health and social care professionals' ability to remove themselves from the process of assisted dying is so difficult that specific exclusion of the care home sector should be a feature of the bill. In any case, organisations and sites should be given the ability to exclude themselves from the act of an assisted death without prejudice to their approval as providers of services to the state. And we do have experience of this with regard to Catholic adoption agencies. There is a real risk that some care homes may feel they have to withdraw from this sector. So I carry on quoting. Those that fund their own care pay substantial sums, often saved over a lifetime, including property wealth. These savings will have been set aside for retirement and to pass on to loved ones. Instead, they are used to fund the costs of their own residential care and substantially subsidise the state. We see the real prospect that those that might fit the criteria for assisted dying under the bill, but have no wish to accelerate their death, would feel an immediate dilemma between prolonging their own lives and the future quality of life of their loved ones. For illustrative purposes, the 6-month period stated within the current bill would equate to between £25,000 and £40,000 worth of expenses borne by an individual paying for their own residential care in the current system. Failings in the system mean that older people who should not be in hospital are held there, causing a burden to the NHS, and local authorities face an ever-growing proportion of funding needed to support social care, without a proportionate increase in funding from central government. I wish to be careful of other people, so I think I'm going to proceed and make this one simple point on behalf of care homes. During the pandemic, we saw the appalling attempts at a widespread use of do-not-attempt resuscitation arrangements for older people. This is a clear demonstration that an existing broken system places a lower value upon the lives of older people than on others. Relationships, and this is the important point, relationships within residential care for older people are both professional and intimate. Carers, care leaders and service managers are all competent health and social care professionals, but they are also friends and confidants of those that live within the social care services. The relationships are familial in the sense of contact for hours each day, and the extension of support to ordinary everyday issues outside the scope of normal healthcare professionals. Our employees deliver loving care and build relationships in a way that residents come to depend on and take comfort from. Such relationships are key to excellent care provision, and these important relationships enhance and prolong lives by providing a sense of purpose and place to older people. I've been around these care homes, Madam Deputy Speaker. They are fantastic places, such love and such care to the most vulnerable in society, and I carry on quoting. In such a setting, it renders the ability for an individual to refuse to partake as useless. In an environment such as a care home, there is no way in which a professional could be fully, quote, separated from assisted dying. Should a resident find that they work with closely seek to inquire about or make a request. Imagine a scenario where an individual living in social care is at the point where they will be provided with the approved substance to bring about their own death. In a care home, this is likely to be in their own room, which will be in close proximity to many other people, older people, who live within that setting. It will be commonplace and understandable that the magnitude of the event will mean that the individual will wish to have company and comfort up to and immediately before and during the period when the substance is taken. A request for the company of a care professional will create a substantial moral dilemma for that person, profoundly so that if they are individually opposed to assisted dying, this is a sort of choice and a sort of pressure on these loving care workers that they will have to make. Even where they are not, it will mean that they will intimately witness the death of someone with whom they have a strong bond, with that death having come about through facilitation rather than naturally. Imagine that pressure on those workers in that care home, Madam Deputy Speaker. The scenario is made worse by the prospect of an assisted death not resulting in a quick nor painless death. There are examples from other jurisdictions of significant complications leading to painful deaths and deeply traumatic experiences for loved ones. Social care professionals should not be exposed to the risk of such experiences. So finally, in conclusion, we ask this House of Commons to consider the unworkable nature of individual exclusion from the processes of assisted dying in social care environments. Consequently, specific exclusion of the care home sector should be a feature of the bill. In any case, organisations and sites should and must be given the ability to exclude themselves from the act of assisted death.
And
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, and I rise today to speak in support of new Clause 10, which is about choice. In fact, the bill is about choice. Choice at the end of life, choice to have a dignified death, choice that is currently being denied to many in untreatable, excruciating pain at the end of their lives, choice that the majority of this country want for themselves. And this new clause is in that same spirit. It offers practitioners a choice by ensuring there is no obligation on any person to provide assistance to a terminally ill adult seeking an assisted death. Terminally ill adults such as my constituent Amy's grandmother, who repeatedly asked Amy, when will it end, from the bed in her hospice, where despite the very best efforts of staff, they were medically unable to treat her constant pain and legally unable to make good on her wish to, in her own words, to be helped to go. The previous version of the bill allowed for doctors to choose not to participate in the assisted dying process if they so wished. This new clause improves the bill, extending that to all registered medical practitioners, health professionals, social care professionals, pharmacists and pharmacy technicians. And it also makes clear that no person is under any duty to act as a witness in the process or a proxy in the process. And it further amends the Employment Rights Act to ensure no one can be subjected to detriment by their employer for providing assistance to those seeking an assisted death or for choosing not to. And that is a good thing. It respects people's choices. Some will not want to aid someone seeking an assisted death because of religious objections or other principled objections. But some, like my constituent Karen, will want to. Karen wrote to me, setting out her father-in-law's terminal diagnosis of a brain tumour, his fear of losing control of mental and bodily functions as his condition progressed, and his hope that the bill would pass in time for him to benefit from it. But Karen is not simply a relative of a terminally ill person. She spent years working in palliative care, watching people lose their independence and dignity as a result of their terminal illness, with patients asking her how they can end the suffering for both themselves and their families. She was heartbroken to witness their distress and pain over days, weeks, or even months, knowing that there was nothing that could be done for them. In their painful final stretches, some felt suicidal, some felt a burden, and for that reason, I must oppose new Clause 16, which would rule ineligible for assisted dying anyone who is substantially motivated by a number of factors, including feeling a burden or suicidal ideation. Firstly, I'll give way.
I'm surprised by his objections to new Clause 16, given that we were assured throughout this bill only applied to people who were terminally ill with 6 months to live. Is he really saying, therefore, that he doesn't want a new clause which says that, which rules out from assisted death people who feel they will be a burden on others, people with mental disorder, and people with disability? Is he really saying that? Because his argument for choice is exactly the argument that in other jurisdictions led to the expansion of assisted death to just those kinds of people.
I'm very grateful for that intervention because it allows me to continue making the argument which will address those points. Because firstly, substantial motivation is vague, undefined and legally imprecise. And this clause is a blunt instrument and an attempt to shut the door on entire groups of people accessing an assisted death. Because how would one establish what a substantially motivating factor in any individual case is? No motivation exists in a vacuum, and feeling a burden can coexist with physical deterioration and untreatable pain. Secondly, if suicidal ideation is to think about dying by taking one's own life, would that not encompass everyone considering assisted dying?
On that point,
I'll give way.
I thank my honourable friend for giving way, and I think today of Norman Ward, who in 2020 shot himself while terminally ill because of the terrible pain that he faced. Would my honourable friend agree that this clause, Clause F, of this amendment would be that Norman Ward would be unable to access the choice that would ensure that he would end his suffering?
I do agree with my honourable friend, and similarly, I cannot support Amendment 102, which requires doctors to ensure there are no remediable suicide risk factors before conducting a preliminary discussion with a patient. There is no clear legal or clinical definition of the term remediable suicide risk factor, and the bill already includes multiple checks on mental capacity and mental illness, including by independent doctors and a specialist panel. The vagueness of this amendment risks wrecking this much-needed bill. I emailed Karen again yesterday to ask if I could refer to her in this speech. Her father-in-law had sadly died in the time that had passed between her initial email and our exchange yesterday. This bill wasn't passed in time for him, and he couldn't benefit from it. But Karen hoped that his story could make some small contribution to changing the law. There don't need to be more people in Karen's father-in-law's or Amy's grandmother's position. They can have choice at the end of life. And our brilliant palliative care workforce, like Karen, can have choice on the kind of care they provide to. I must make progress, I'm afraid. So I hope that members across the House will join in support of new Clause 10 to strengthen the bill and reinforce that choice for patients and practitioners is at the heart of this legislation, and oppose amendments and clauses that would wreck the bill and put that choice at risk.
Yeah. And before I call the next speaker, after his comments, I will be asking members to limit their comments to no longer than 8 minutes. So I call Tom Gordon.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I'd like to start by thanking the honourable member for Spen Valley for bringing this bill forward and the opportunity to have served on that bill committee. I rise to speak in favour of Amendment 4 tabled in my name. This amendment goes to the very heart of what this bill is all about: dignity, compassion and choice at the end of life.
Would the honourable member give way on that?
I will give way.
Thank you. And my honourable friend is quite right to point to the compassion and fairness that is rightly at the heart of this bill for those terminally ill. But will my honourable friend agree with my constituents who would like to see this extended to those terminally ill with motor neuron disease and neurodegenerative disorders, so that they have choice and dignity too, by extending the eligibility period?
I thank my honourable friend for that comment. And I think what was really interesting is the way in which the debate was conducted at second reading and the Bill Committee, and how we were meant to be having that respectful debate. And it's disappointing to hear comments already from opponents. This amendment seeks a simple yet crucial change to extend the eligibility period for those with neurodegenerative conditions from 6 months to 12 months. This is a change that's already reflected in legislation in 5 of 6 Australian states. My amendment mirrors their wording and is not based on conjecture, but on medical reality, international precedent, and most importantly, the lived experiences of those facing some of the most harrowing diseases imaginable. This amendment does not expand the bill's reach beyond terminal conditions. It simply acknowledges that for people with conditions like MND and other diseases that are neurodegenerative, the current 6-month prognosis requirement creates a cruel and unnecessary barrier. There are progressive... I will give way.
And I'm sure he will note, and the House will be interested to note, that the jurisdiction of Scotland and also the Crown dependencies of the Isle of Man and Jersey have variations which are different to that which we are being discussed. But very briefly, would he join me in commiserating with the family of Yola Dawkins, who I mentioned back in November as a campaigner? She died of motor neuron disease on her birthday last week. Let us remember that we are doing this for real people who are undergoing real suffering at the end of life.
I thank my honourable friend for that intervention. She makes a real pertinent point about how other jurisdictions nearby our own are having different bills and the conversations they've had around that. And that's why I've tabled this amendment, to make sure we have that debate in this place. And I would extend my condolences to the family. These are progressive, irreversible diseases. Their trajectory is well understood. Their toll is devastating. People with MND, for instance, often face a relentless loss of muscle function, leaving them unable to move, unable to speak, or even swallow. But before they reach the 6-month prognosis threshold, they may already be enduring intolerable suffering, and crucially, many will lose the capacity needed to make an application before they ever qualify. This bill already contains the most robust protections of any assisted dying bill in the world. Mandatory capacity assessments, a multi-step approval process, a clear requirement for terminal illness. We have gone further than any other jurisdiction in terms of safeguards. I'll give way.
May I thank my honourable friend. May I put the idea that what you are suggesting and what the previous intervention is suggesting is a slippery slope, is an enormous concern, and I suspect in a few years' time we will be seeing a very different bill from what we're seeing now.
I thank the honourable member for his intervention. The point that I would make is this amendment is designed to stop having a conversation about eligibility after this bill. I want to see a bill that would stop that argument about a slippery slope and give equitable access to people of all health conditions. I will not give way. I'll make a little progress. We've gone further than any other jurisdiction in terms of safeguards. So why then, if we are satisfied that those robust safeguards, are we excluding those with neurodegenerative diseases, people who are terminally ill, on the basis of an arbitrary timeframe? We say this bill is about choice, but for someone who's already lost their ability to speak, to move, and knows they're on a rapid decline, what choice do we offer them? Wait until your prognosis hits 6 months. I'll make some progress. Wait until your prognosis hits 6 months, if a doctor can say so with confidence, and hope that you'll still have the cognitive ability to apply. Let me speak to the reality of this amendment with a story from one of my constituents. A constituent who didn't wish to be named wrote to me about her brother, who died at 58 from MND. Prior to his diagnosis, he was strong and healthy, and as she put it, a lot of fun. A great family man, but his illness was dreadful to watch progress, and it made a profound impact upon the family. It took 18 months of effort, worry, and deep distress before he finally passed away. He wanted to have control over the time of his death, knowing what was to come. My constituent wrote, and I quote, "It's a difficult subject for most of us to contemplate, but in his particular case, the possibility of an assisted death would have given him much comfort. Unless you're actually affected," I will make a little progress, I'm mid-quote, "unless you are actually affected by something as desperate as MND, you cannot understand what it really means to have such an option." She's right. We can debate legal safeguards, ethics and precedents all day in this chamber, but for those living with devastating diseases, this isn't theoretical, it's personal, it's urgent, and it's real.
Would the honourable member give way?
I will give way.
I thank the honourable member for giving way on this particular point. This is a very personal one for me because much of my motivation in supporting this bill comes from having watched a member of my family die of motor neurons disease. And while I accept that perhaps it would have been preferable if that could have been included, motor neuron and other degenerative diseases could have been included, I also accept that we do not want to go down the slippery slope. However, I think there is a difference between degenerative diseases like motor neurons disease and extending the bill to other conditions. So perhaps we could consider supporting that, because I know I would not want anyone to go through what I witnessed without the choice to end it, without going through more pain.
I'm Gordon. I thank my honourable friend for that really powerful and compelling intervention. I've lost my train of thought now. Thank you. What we risk doing is creating a two-tier system. We say we want to fix the status quo because we know it isn't working, but if this bill forces people, like my constituent's brother, to consider dying earlier, or worse, still have to travel abroad for an assisted death in another far-off distant country under different laws, then have we really changed anything? We have a situation where we may be saying to people with cancer, they may be able to access a dignified death under this law, but those with conditions that are neurodegenerative, like MND, they must either endure prolonged suffering or act prematurely, just to stay ahead of a ticking clock. It's my view that this is not justice, and it's certainly not compassion. International experience backs up this amendment. In Victoria, where there is a 12-month limit which applies to neurodegenerative conditions, only 7% of applicants lose the capacity before they can proceed. In New Zealand, where the 6-month threshold remains, many people are excluded because they lose that ability too soon. We know here in the UK alone, MND takes over 2,000 lives a year. That's 6 people every single day. So today, I'm asking colleagues not to turn away from these people, not to dismiss their fears or their hopes or their pleas for fairness. I will make some progress. This amendment is not about eroding the careful work that the Bill Committee has done to expand the rigorous safeguards this bill already has. It is about ensuring that some people with the most cruel and terminal conditions are not left out of the very options we're seeking to give others. If we believe in dignity, I'm coming to the close of my remarks, so I will make some progress. If we believe in dignity, let us make it so dignity includes everyone. If we believe in autonomy, let us not deny it to those who may lose their voice tomorrow. And if we believe in compassion, let it be compassion that recognises the lived reality of all terminal illnesses and does not consign those with MND to the status quo.
Florence Eshalome.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I am going to be mindful of time and allow other colleagues to speak. So I've carefully made sure that my speech is short, so I will not be taking any intervention, colleagues. I voted against this bill at second reading on the grounds of inadequate safeguards against the coercion of minority communities. This was based on my belief that if we are to legislate for something as serious as the end of someone's life, then that bar it should reach should be deemed safe, needs to be much higher than in other areas. In the time since, I have closely followed the scrutiny that this bill has received at committee and report stage. Madam Deputy Speaker, I hope that my concerns would be addressed, but I'm sad to say I'm even more worried now than I was then. Before we get onto the important new clauses and amendments that would provide important safeguards, I want to state again that I do not think that this bill is the appropriate mechanism for a national decision of this magnitude to be made. And ultimately, any decision on it should be led by the government and the clear will of this House, not on promises made to people without an elected mandate. I want to pay tribute to the work of tireless campaigners on a number of important issues in relation to the scrutiny of this bill since second reading. This has resulted in many amendments and new clauses being tabled by members from across the House aimed at strengthening the protections for at-risk groups. As I alluded to, I sadly do not have enough time to speak to all of them that I support, but I am grateful for the many efforts of many who have led up and spoken today. I will speak to Amendment 16, which is tabled in my name. The amendment to Clause 28 makes it explicit that there would be no obligation on any care home or hospice to provide assisted dying on their premises if they are regulated by the Care Quality Commission or the Care Inspectorate Wales. I understand that the member for Spen Valley has tabled new Clause 10 to replace Clause 28, ensuring that there is no obligation on anyone to provide assistance. Whilst I welcome the expansion of protections this provides to individual practitioners who do not wish to provide assistance, I do not believe that this is comprehensive. Dr. Jamelia Hussain, a palliative care consultant working predominantly with ethnic minority communities in Bradford, gave oral evidence at the Bill Committee. She said, and I quote, "I have gone into those communities and I've spoken to them about this bill. What they say overwhelmingly to me is we are scared. We are really fearful that this is going to result in disproportionate impact on our community. We've seen this through COVID and we are scared." Heartbreakingly, she also said, "Almost every week, one of the first things I have to reassure patients about is that I cannot legally do anything to shorten their life." This is front and centre of the fear of those patients, and we see it all the time. This is not an academic or theoretical risk. Madam Deputy Speaker, are we really prepared to sideline those unheard voices and risk embedding further inequalities in the healthcare as we legislate? We are all elected to this place to elevate the voices of those who feel they are furthest away from power. And if we are to achieve this, we must make decisions to honour their experiences and to legislate to offer to protect them. But if hospices are unable to opt out of providing assisted dying as a collective policy, then the people who already feel ignored by the healthcare systems are more likely of fearing accessing the care they need at the end of their lives. This would further create unnecessary suffering, something I know that we are all united in wanting to avoid. And it is on this theme that I will close. I do not doubt the good intentions of many members choosing to support this bill today, and I thank the many constituents that have contacted me on both sides of this. But, Madam Deputy Speaker, as politicians, we have to be clear that members with valid concerns about this bill are not raising it because of some ideology or religious belief. It is because we recognise that if this bill passes, it may impact everyone, not just those who may wish to die. It is not wrong or scaremongering to consider the wider family life, relationships with feelings of burdens or coercion, including vulnerable women and people from a BME community at the end of their life. It is not wrong or scaremongering for us as politicians, as we continue to receive correspondence from our constituents about the broken state of our NHS and the social care, and for us to think carefully about a bill which may alter the very relationship between doctors and their patients. And it is frankly insulting to disabled people, hard-working professionals up and down the country who have raised many valid concerns about this bill to have it dismissed as religious beliefs. But I've sadly come to the conclusion that instead of giving the universal right to dignity in death, it will come and it will reinforce the health inequalities that deprive so many from our vulnerable communities that dignity in life. I urge members to keep this at the forefront as we vote today and to reject this.
I call Sarah Bourne.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I'm grateful to be able to speak in this debate today, and will be focusing on three particular areas: New Clause 9, Amendments 51 and Amendment 38. And for time, I'll not take interventions just so that other members may speak. New Clause 9, in my name, essentially establishes the standard of proof, namely the level of certainty and the amount of evidence required in the decision-making under this bill. Now, to put this into context for members, there are various standards of proof which are used in law. At the very lowest end of the scale is reasonable belief, which means a belief that would be held by an ordinary person in the same circumstances. Then, there is the civil standard of proof, known as the balance of probabilities. This is sometimes known as the 50% plus 1 rule, or more likely than not. Finally, we have the most serious, which is the beyond reasonable doubt test, which applies for criminal cases. This goes further than the balance of probabilities and requires the person to be sure. Now, given the lack of clarity and confusion at committee stage as to whether the test for doctors should be reasonable belief or the balance of probabilities, I have proposed this new clause. As you will see, it has 3 parts. Subclause 1 relates to the assessment by the coordinating and independent doctor. And here, I argue that the balance of probabilities test should be used because it feels perhaps overly punitive to exclude someone from the process at the initial stage if it is more than likely than not they'll meet the test, but there are some doubts. However, subclause 2, the assisted dying review panel, to my mind, must make their assessment beyond reasonable doubt. Given that they will have all the reports from the doctors and the professionals, if at this stage they are not sure beyond reasonable doubt, then the application should not be approved. This is an essential safeguard. The final component, subclause 3, relates to the moment of supplying the lethal drugs. The doctor is required to satisfy themselves that the person has capacity, a clear, settled and informed wish to end their life, and is not being coerced. At this point, the balance of probabilities test does not suffice. It must be beyond reasonable doubt. This is life and death. All honourable members need to ask themselves if they are happy, without this amendment, with someone being provided lethal drugs to end their life by our NHS in circumstances where we are not absolutely certain. Now, I acknowledge for the record that there has been an objection to the use of beyond reasonable doubt by the member for Solihull West and Shirley on the grounds of whether it is right to apply a criminal standard of proof where the civil standard may be flexible enough. However, I would note that in the House of Lords case, Re B, in 2008, Baroness Hale put it, "There are some proceedings, though civil in form, whose nature is such that it is appropriate to apply the criminal standard of proof," and a subsequent 2012 case affirmed this. Now, if we stay silent and let the assisted dying review panel and the courts try to work out whether they should interpret satisfied here to mean the civil or the criminal standard, it would merely result in numerous litigation battles. On a matter so serious as death, we, as Parliament, must provide the clarity needed. Without this, the bill is simply not safe. Now, my second area today is on the informed consent and complications, which is Amendment 51 to Clause 11 of this bill. This amendment would impose a duty on assessing doctors to inform individuals seeking an assisted death of any reasonable body of medical or scientific opinion indicating that the prescribed substance carries risks of complications, including pain. Now, Clause 11 currently requires doctors to explain how the drug is expected to bring about death and to discuss with the individual what ought to be done in the event of complications. However, it omits a critical element identified by the General Medical Council in its guidance on consent, namely the obligation to communicate known risks of harm and the uncertainties surrounding those risks. A patient cannot be said to give informed consent if they are not made aware of the full range of potential complications, including pain, distress, and the possibility that the drug may not act as expected. Yep. The state of Oregon's most recent data shows that complications were recorded in approximately 3% of cases in 2023, but historic data shows a complication rate of 11%. Now, since the introduction of the law, there have been 9 recorded instances of patients regaining consciousness after ingesting the prescribed substances, and time to death has ranged from 3 minutes to 137 hours. That is more than 5.5 days. Now, Canadian studies indicate that around 5% of oral-assisted deaths result in prolonged and often distressing process. In some instances, medical intervention is required. Now, evidence also suggests that younger adults, particularly those aged between 18 to 24, are more likely to experience extended and unpredictable deaths. Furthermore, not all complications may be outwardly evident. High doses of barbiturates combined with paralytic agents which suppress all voluntary muscle movement may result in what outwardly appears to be a calm and peaceful death, but in fact may conceal considerable psychological suffering. Now, the member for Spen Valley talks about offering choice, but a choice made in the absence of information is not true autonomy. It is abdication. A meaningful decision requires that the individual is aware not only of what is intended to happen, but also what may plausibly go wrong. In both Oregon and California, legislation explicitly requires that patients be informed of any known risks associated with the medication to be administered. So why would we adopt a lesser standard here? This amendment simply calls for honesty. And finally, but very briefly, I also want to add my support to Amendment 38, which clarifies that an individual who is not already terminally ill under the definition of Clause 2, subsection 1, cannot qualify by refusing standard treatment or taking steps to induce a terminal condition. Now, as someone living with type 1 diabetes, which, for the record, is a progressive illness that cannot be reversed by treatment, and knowing that this condition is solely managed by the individual, or not, in the cases of extreme stress, this is an incredibly important protection. Alongside the multiple daily injections, 24/7 thinking and monitoring of everything you do, a diabetic could be at risk of suffering with diabetic distress or even developing disordered eating. This could prove fatal if standard treatments are not accepted. They should never be offered assisted suicide. They could recover with the right support. The member for Spen Valley knows I've spoken to her about my concerns about conditions like diabetes being caught unintentionally. This amendment would be a step to protect those who may be unable to protect themselves using the standard means. Diabetes and anorexia have been a reason for assisted suicide in Oregon, so please be aware of what could happen. Madam Deputy Speaker, on a personal note, not long after I was diagnosed as a type 1 diabetic, I suffered diabetic distress. I didn't know how I could continue with this condition, and I convinced every single person at my workplace that I was absolutely fine. And it was only that my parents caught that I was in this position here today to get the support. So please, please, think seriously about the unintended consequences and protect vulnerable people like myself. Thank you.
Dr. Marie Tidball.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. At the second reading, my decision to support this bill was one of the hardest I've ever had to make. one which required me to go to the very depths of myself and draw on my experience as a child in excruciating pain, along with the extensive poignant experiences shared with me by my constituents. As I said then, my support was conditional upon specific changes at committee stage. I'm pleased to say all these changes have been made. As a member of that committee, it was the most extraordinary cross-party deliberative process I've ever witnessed in my 20 years of analysing legislation as an academic and policy researcher working in disability law and policy. On the committee, I worked to strengthen the voices of disabled people and their protection under the bill's provisions. I moved amendments to introduce Clause 20 on independent advocates and Clause 44, creating a disability advisory board. These are augmented today by Amendments 75 and 91, brought by the Honourable Member for Spen Valley. Clause 20 established the role of independent advocates for a qualifying person engaging with the bill for them to effectively understand their options around end-of-life care, empowering disabled people to be treated with the dignity and respect that we deserve. These independent advocates would be required to undertake specialist training and would be available regardless of whether the individual is ultimately found to be eligible to request an assisted death. This clause, I will make progress. I'm respectful to all those on both sides of the House that wish to speak in full today. The clause flowed directly from evidence we heard from oral witnesses, including leading disability scholars and disability policy experts. In conjunction with Amendment 75 before us today, those with autism, along with a learning disability or a mental disorder, as defined under the Mental Health Act 1983, will all qualify for an independent advocate. Amendment 75, which defines learning disability, will also apply to Clause 7, which provides for specific up-to-date training on reasonable adjustments and safeguards for autistic people and people with a learning disability for registered practitioners. At committee, I was grateful for the support of the Honourable Member for Bexley Heath and Crayford, and to my delight, the Honourable Member for East Wiltshire for these independent advocate roles, along with unanimous support of the committee for the introduction of Clause 44, which sets up the Disability Advisory Board. This advisory board entrenches the voices of disabled people in this bill to embed a long-term and iterative structure to report on its implementation and impact on disabled people to the Secretary of State. Crucially, this board must consist of disabled people and representatives from disabled people's organisations. Building on these clauses, Amendment 91 before us today expands the duty to collect additional information about whether, immediately before death, the person seeking assistance had a disability within the meaning of Section 6 of the Equality Act 2010, other than a disability amounting to terminal illness within the meaning of this bill. So often, control is taken away from disabled people in all sorts of circumstances. I passionately believe in inclusive healthcare for disabled people. Taken together, all these measures will create a solid foundation to enable disabled people to have a strong voice in advocating for themselves in their choices for the end-of-life care and, importantly, a seat at the table in shaping the monitoring of the bill, providing continued scrutiny and accountability. In conclusion, there were many moments during the committee stage where I reflected on how I would want to live a good death. The most poignant was when Julie Thienpont described the death of her terminally ill husband, Guy, when he sought an assistance to death in Spain, saying, "Guy had always been a bit of a cowboy, and he always said that he wanted to die with his boots on. I'm proud to say that that is what he did. At the end, we were holding hands, and I said to him, 'Don't be afraid.' He said, "I'm not afraid," and he winked at me just before he closed his eyes. May we all have the opportunity to be able to choose a good death, wearing our cowboy boots with the love of our lives by our sides.
Yeah. Liz Jarvis.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I'm grateful for the opportunity to contribute to this vital debate. It is absolutely imperative that we get this bill right and that protections and procedures are watertight. And I thank my constituents who have written to me on both sides. Today I'm supporting Amendment 4, tabled by my honourable friend, the member for Harrogate and Knaresborough, which would allow those with neurodegenerative diseases to be eligible for an assisted death if they are within 12 months of dying. Nigel Hartley MBE, the CEO of Mountbatten Hampshire Hospice in my constituency, told me palliative care and assisted dying are not and should not be at odds with each other. Yeah. Palliative care can provide incredible support, and I'm very glad that this debate has reopened the national conversation about issues of funding for palliative care. However, as I know from my personal experience with my mum, who died last March after a 7-year struggle with Alzheimer's, palliative care can sometimes only go so far. Amendment 4 recognises that those with neurodegenerative illnesses deserve the same compassion, control and dignity at the end of their lives as others do, and by extending the time frame to 12 months, they will be given more control over their ultimate decision. I also support new Clause 10, which would extend the right for any professional involved to opt out from providing assistance under the bill and extends protections to a broader range of professionals who may be involved. And I also support Amendment 59 and Amendment 62, which relate to training on domestic abuse. These amendments are critical to ensure that the coordinating doctor can identify where there may be signs of domestic abuse. The inclusion of this training enhances the bill's protective framework, as no medical professional without specific and up-to-date training on domestic abuse would be able to serve as a coordinating doctor. Importantly, Amendment 74 defines domestic abuse using the language of the Domestic Abuse Act 2021, explicitly including coercive, controlling and economic abuse. Amendment 63 removes any ambiguity about the scope of eligibility, making clear that only terminal illness qualifies under this legislation. This clarity is essential to maintaining public trust and ensuring that the bill is not open to misinterpretation or misuse. It can be incredibly difficult for people with disabilities and their families and carers to get their concerns across, and they can often feel unseen and unheard. So this amendment is vital. Finally, Madam Deputy Speaker, I would like to contribute by paying tribute to the Honourable Member for Spen Valley for her work on this bill and to her tremendous courage, determination, willingness to engage and resilience. As other members have said, the decision before us is fundamentally about whether we believe in an individual's right to have choice at the end of their life. I know what my mum would have said.
Rachel Maskell. Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I beg to move Amendments 26, 45 and 46 in my name and other members, and I'm grateful for their support. Briefly on Amendment 26, hospice care is not a formulation of care, but a clinical setting where palliative care is delivered, so I trust the House will accept my amendment for accuracy. Now let me turn to Amendment 45 and consequential Amendment 46. The literature points to a complex clinical decision-making, of which this is being safer if made in the context of multidisciplinary teams, as advocated for by the professional bodies at the very start of the process. Further, it screens out unconscious bias and provides for clinical accountability with robust interdependency. It demands a deliberative process and safeguards clinicians and patients with more secure outcomes. I've talked extensively to the professional bodies, clinicians, and read the academic evidence on this. And in drawing out best practice, this amendment will provide such safeguards, ensuring that the patient is at the heart. Honourable members will know from the evidence to the Bill Committee that this initial assessment is the most important part of the process, and clinicians and professional bodies do not understand why psychiatrists and social workers are placed in a quasi-judicial role rather than to use their clinical and social expertise.
The process makes the wrong assumptions without this change. There's a predication towards an assisted death, rather than recognising the insecure position that someone with a terminal illness finds themselves having and the safeguards that are required. There are many reasons for suicidality, and they should be explored. In clinical practice, should someone determine that they want to end their life for whatever reason, then a clinician would seek to ensure that right professionals were involved in the care of the person with exploration, diagnosis, and, where necessary, therapeutic and pharmacological interventions. I won't. Dr. Ladi Smith, the President of the Royal College of Psychiatrists, could not have been clearer. Academic research says the same. When someone is in receipt of a terminal diagnosis, there is frequently an episode of depressive disorder. Dr. Price presented evidence that those who had a wish to hasten death were 18 times more likely to feel suicidal. They say mental disorders are treatable. The spike in suicidal ideation and action is highest in the first few months following terminal diagnosis and then dissipates with time or intervention. Again, evidenced. People change their mind, no longer wanting to die. As with other aspects of the bill, poor care, poor pain management and poor symptom control, or the fear thereof, is why someone seeks to end their life. This can be palliated. Colleagues must recognise the paucity of mental health provision given to somebody when they receive a terminal diagnosis. Often no psychological aftercare. People failed, yet this should not be a reason to die. So I ask for a panel with a social worker to assess the psychological needs of a patient, experts in being able to detect coercion, intrinsic and extrinsic, understanding people that are the most vulnerable, and a fusion of complex emotions, anxiety and fear. Solutions can be found by them. Then a psychiatrist. Depression, anxiety and fear are natural responses to trauma. However, can be treated with the right interventions. It detects at the point somebody expresses a wish to die. Then a person can have a wish to live. The travesty of getting this wrong is unconscionable. Then a palliative care consultant registered on the GMC Specialist Register, understanding the very actions that can alleviate somebody's suffering. Evidence at the Bill Committee from Sue Ryder showed how poor provision led to somebody's consideration of an assisted death. Likewise, President of the Association of Palliative Medicine, Dr. Sarah Cox, set out, and I quote, "We know that effective palliative care can change a terminal ill person's point of view from wanting to die to wanting to live." Evidence. A point I have heard from all leaders of on our Palliative Care Commission. These are the specialists who know how to palliate physical, psychological, socially and spiritual needs of a patient. And they have such techniques which many people have not had access because of poor provision. In our Palliative Care Commission, which reported on Tuesday, and please read the evidence-rich report drawn from best practice, we reported excellence in end-of-life provision is achievable. Too many people are just not getting access. Without this, I fear the bill not only leads the patient down one route, that to die, and this is not choice at all. It's a path to an assisted death. Then I asked for two doctors, a generalist and a specialist, one of which is the coordinating doctor. Yesterday, the Royal College of Physicians stated that there is inadequate protections of patients and professionals in the bill, and I quote, "Notably, the proposed mechanism of decision-making are not in line with good clinical and professional practice. Parliament must address these critical issues in the legislation or risk failing to protect vulnerable patients and uphold the integrity of clinical practice." End quote. This week, the Chair of Royal College of GPs has said they've got real concerns about the practical and legal implications within this bill. And I seek to address that assessment process with my amendment. But I must quickly say to the Minister, if he thinks just 2 days of training for a doctor is sufficient, well, I can tell him they will not have the necessary competencies. But it even suggests in the impact assessment it will just be 90 minutes online with 60 minutes interactive training. That is simply not good enough. Poor medicine makes assumptions, and this bill certainly does it. Assumes somebody wants to die. However, it's a clinician's duty to have an open and inquiring mind, to seek out reason, not to assume, not least when government's suicidal prevention strategy recognises such. It is only through examination can we establish why someone wants to die. And Chapter 8 of the Palliative Care Commission reports that 24% of the population know very little or have not heard of palliative care, as set out by the King's College study. The bill only presumes an assisted death, not choice. Finally, how to do this? Separate or joint assessments, and then a panel meeting to deliberate. So not a quasi-judicial panel, but evidence-led assessment where real choice is offered. Listen to the experts, hear their collective voice. This bill is unsafe. It is why the professional bodies are speaking out against this bill. While my amendment will nudge it into a safer place, the scale of concern far exceeds this. Colleagues, we must follow the experts' evidence.
Sir Jeremy Wright.
Very much indeed, Madam Deputy Speaker. In view of the number of people who wish to speak in this debate, I'll restrict my remarks to the amendments in my name and the name of others. Those are 47, 48 and 49. And these amendments are focused on the stage in the process which involves the multidisciplinary panels established in Clause 14. And the purpose of these amendments is to make that system work better. A panel is intended to be an additional safeguard. The Honourable Lady for Spen Valley has made that very clear, and they are, of course, the successor to the involvement of a High Court judge assessing the merits of each case. And the role of the panel is to determine whether it is satisfied of the matters set out in Clause 15, subparagraph 2. Now, some of those matters are procedural. For example, whether or not the person seeking the certificate is aged over 18 or resident in the UK, or that declarations and assessments that should be made have been made. But others are matters of judgment, including professional judgment, such as whether an illness is terminal, or whether the person applying for a certificate of eligibility has the mental capacity to do so. But the remaining category of matters to be considered are matters of broader judgment. And those are likely to be, I suspect, where the panel focuses most of its attention, particularly the last two on the list in Clause 15. And those are, first of all, whether the person applying has a clear, settled and informed wish to end their life, and secondly, that there is no coercion or pressure from anyone else. And on those matters, the panel will hear from the relevant doctors who will have had to make a judgment on those things, but I do not think the intent of the bill is, or should be, that the panel simply confirms the doctor has reached a judgment and then adopts that judgment. The panel should, of course, reach its own judgment. It's right, of course, too, that the panel will also hear from the person wishing to die and will make its assessment of them. But particularly on the last matter, the absence of coercion or pressure, it may well be that highly relevant evidence will come from others, from family, friends or others who know the person well. And we are familiar with at least one scenario where a new partner has isolated the person in question before they suddenly and unexpectedly change their view on their own assisted death. The problem, Madam Deputy Speaker, is that under the bill as it stands, it's very difficult and perhaps impossible for those who know the person seeking a certificate well to know that those proceedings are underway or in prospect. They may not know, and nobody has to tell them, that the person has made the relevant declarations, or even that they have an intention to die, or indeed that there is any reason to submit any evidence they may have. Now, Madam Deputy Speaker, I am not saying that every case where someone has not told their family and friends of their decision to seek an assisted death will be concerning. But I think it is fair to say that a disproportionate number of the concerning cases will be in that category. And in those cases, the panel may be making a judgment in the absence of relevant, perhaps crucial evidence, and they simply cannot do their job properly if that is so. Amendment, of course I give way.
Is my friend concerned, as I am, that the panel doesn't even need to consider looking at evidence from family or friends or those caring for or treating the person. And is my right honourable friend also concerned that while they may be required to hear from the person, that is only unless there are exceptional circumstances, and there is no requirement to actually ask any questions at all.
Yes, I understand the Honourable Lady's point, and I've seen her amendments on this subject, which I think are very sensible. And I think we need to think about the way in which the panel process will actually unfold. And if we believe, and that I think is a common view, that this is an important safeguard, we need to do everything we can to make sure it's an effective one too. And just as her amendments seek to do, my Amendment 47 seeks to remedy this problem by ensuring that the Assisted Dying Commissioner notifies anyone they think may have relevant evidence to give so that they can give it. That evidence may, of course, not change the panel's decision, but in some of the most troubling cases, it will. And the opportunity for the panel to consider that evidence when the stakes are this high must surely be provided for. Now, Madam Deputy Speaker, I accept that what I'm proposing is an infringement on the privacy of the person wishing to die. It is a fetter on their ability to choose to die without informing their family or friends, as they may wish. But this bill is all about balancing the rights of a person to die as they wish with, on the other hand, our duty to protect the vulnerable from abuse. That is exactly why the stages through which a person must go in order to be assisted to die are in this bill, including obtaining the grant of a certificate from a panel, which, as I say, to be of value, must surely add new protections to the other stages.
I wouldn't mind running on that one.
Very briefly.
Very briefly.
John
In its original incarnation, we were assured that one of the key safeguards was a legal test. Had that been retained in the bill, of course, that process would have enabled the collection of evidence in the very way he's describing. It is partly because the safeguard has been weakened, we have the dilemma that his amendments seek to deal with.
Well, I understand my right honourable friend's point. I'm not sure I entirely agree with him. I think some of the procedural problems I'm describing would have existed even with the previous iteration of the bill, but certainly with its current iteration they are there. And what I'm seeking to do at this report stage is trying to fix the problem. And it's really a problem because it arises from the difficulty of the three qualified individuals that will constitute these panels to express a considered judgment. And if we are to have added value in the panel stage of this process, we have to enable the panel surely to make good judgments. And good judgments come from the capacity to assess all the relevant evidence. The bill as it stands makes it very hard for the panel to have access to all that evidence in every case, but perhaps especially in those cases where its additional safeguard is most needed.
On that point,
I give way.
Let's just raise the point in regards to the panel and the concerns that again were raised by the Royal College of Psychiatrists, and actually their point 5 in their concerns is actually it's not clear what the psychiatrist's role on that panel would actually be.
You're right.
Well, I think the Honourable Gentleman makes a fair point. I think what we can expect is that the psychiatrist on the panel will subject particularly the requirement on mental capacity to some considerable professional scrutiny, but nobody on the panel, whatever their professional competence may be, is capable of doing the job properly if they haven't access to the necessary evidence. And that's the point that I'm making. We must make sure that they do. Now, I would also argue that the fact that the panel may sit in public is not a sufficient answer to the problem I'm raising. And that's first because there will be many panels considering many cases. And we cannot expect those who have evidence of coercion, for example, to watch the lists in case the person they know may happen to appear in them, when of course they have no expectation that they will. And secondly, because the panel will not sit in public in every case. Schedule 2, paragraph 6 says, and I quote, panels are to determine referrals in public. So that is the clear presumption, and that is welcome. But paragraph 6.2 says that the chair of the panel may decide the panel will sit in private at the request of the person to whom a referral relates. There's nothing I can see in the bill about any grounds on which the panel chair may refuse such a request. So it will certainly occasionally, or perhaps often, be the case that the panel will sit in private and no one will know what it is doing. Madam Deputy Speaker, the next issue is the way in which a panel will go about making the judgments it needs to make. And that brings me to Amendment 48. Now, most judicial and quasi-judicial hearings, as we all know in this country, are conducted on an adversarial basis. And that is not, by the way, a reference to the tone of proceedings, but to the presentation of both sides of an argument, so the tribunal can reach the right conclusion. That is what our judges and lawyers are used to. And that matters here because, again, this quasi-judicial stage in the process of seeking assistance to die is being offered as important reassurance that things are going to be done safely. But it cannot offer that reassurance if panels are being asked to adopt a process for which they are ill-equipped. And that is not a criticism of those who will sit on those panels. And I accept that under the bill as it stands, a panel may hear from and may question any other person beyond the person seeking the certificate and the relevant doctors. But as I've sought to address in Amendment 47, as things stand, those other persons will in all likelihood not know about the panel's proceedings and therefore will not come forward with the evidence of their own initiative. The panel would have to go out and find them. And how exactly are they to do that? How do the panel know who may have relevant evidence to give, and with what resources will they seek them out? The position on what resources will be available more generally for the process under the bill remains unclear, but the impact assessment suggests that panels are expected to deal with 2 cases a day, and that suggests they'll spend somewhere between 3 and 4 hours on each. That, Madam Deputy Speaker, is not much latitude for further investigation. So Amendment 48 proposes that the Commissioner should notify a designated authority on an application for a certificate. The Secretary of State can choose the appropriate one, and that authority will supply an advocate to the panel with the responsibility to raise arguments against the grant of a certificate which the panel will not otherwise hear. And I think that is important because it ensures that there is another participant in the panel process who can at least help the panel by prompting consideration of concerns, reservations or grounds for further inquiry before decisions are made. And finally, Madam Deputy Speaker, my third amendment, Amendment 49, is about what happens once a panel has reached its conclusion. Now, Clause 16 provides for a person seeking a certificate to be able to ask for reconsideration of a panel's refusal to grant one. But of course, the bill currently provides no equivalent right to someone who believes a panel should not have granted a certificate to challenge that decision. Anyone in that position would need to resort to judicial review, which is complex and expensive.
Could I gently suggest to the right honourable member that he might be bringing his remarks to a close? There are many other members who wish to contribute this afternoon.
I certainly am, Madam Deputy Speaker, and I'm doing my best, I hope as briefly as I can, to explain what are technical amendments in a hugely important bill, in a part of the bill that the promoter has advocated for because she believes it's a safeguard. I think it's important, Madam Deputy Speaker, that we establish whether it is such a safeguard and if it can be improved, how it can be improved, but I entirely take your strictures on board and I will come as quickly as I can to a conclusion. And Madam Deputy Speaker, the reason I'm making the point I'm making is that this is not an equality of arms point. I accept that these are not opposing parties in the traditional sense, but it's really about the presentation of new evidence. Presumably, advice to someone whose application for a certificate has been refused and who has new evidence to present would be to reapply to the Commissioner. But what is someone who has new evidence to challenge the basis for an existing certificate to do? Judicial review is no help. That's about the soundness of the decision already taken, which will be assessed using the evidence already presented to the panel which took the original decision. And the obvious scenario here is where someone comes forward after the granting of a certificate, perhaps because they did not know of the previous proceedings, with pertinent evidence of coercion. There is currently no mechanism for that evidence to be considered. And I'm not suggesting that people should simply be able to delay the process without grounds. My amendment suggests that the Commissioner will need to screen all such applications to ensure there's an arguable case to be made. But, Madam Deputy Speaker, finally, I make these amendments and put them forward because I believe it's important at report stage in this bill to accept that the bill may become law and to make it the best law we can make it. This particular phase of the process can only be a safeguard if we enable the panel to do its job properly. These provisions are currently defective in that respect, and I think it's extraordinarily important that we make them effective for the panel to do its job properly.
Point of order, Madam Deputy Speaker. Point of order, Simon Hall. I don't wish to be flippant or test the patience of the House, but we've just heard an important speech from a former Attorney General on some key legal points. This is still a private member's proposal. Is it in order, or how can the supporter of the bill, the sponsor of the bill, the Honourable Lady, the member for Spen Valley, respond to whether or not to accept amendments to her proposed legislation if she's not in the chamber to hear the arguments? Is it not a discourtesy to the House and those who have spent some considerable time working on amendments on both sides of the argument for her not to be here to hear what they are advocating? Can I thank the honourable member for his point of order? He will know that that is not a matter for the chair. Can I remind members that whilst there is no formal time limit, there are many members who wish to contribute in a very important debate, and it would be very helpful if members could keep their remarks to within the 8 minutes that was suggested. Kevin Bonavia.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. At second reading of the bill, I voted in favour, partly because I believed in the principle of it, because I do believe in the right to choice and the right not to choose, but also because I believed that we needed to have a way of checking somebody's clear intention. At the moment, there are horrible deaths that are going on, and there are no such checks in place. So I was keen to see how this House could come up with a system that will not be perfect, but better than the terrible status quo that we have now. And in the bill at that stage, we had 2 checks by medical practitioners, and in that third layer, the involvement of a High Court judge. And although I was pleased with the third layer, I was not convinced that that third layer was the right way to deal with that matter. So I was pleased that the committee has now proposed a panel now of experts to make those checks. And the previous member has, I believe, rightly looked at some of those points. But for me, having that panel in place is very important, and it's our job today to see how we can strengthen that. And I want to speak to Amendments 78 and 79. And I think the improvement in Amendment 78 there is to make sure that we have a unanimous decision, and that includes as a decision in favour of a certificate of eligibility. Abstentions will not apply. I think that is better than that was previously in the draft, and certainly better than a High Court judge. And Amendment 79 setting out those written reasons, because there will be scrutiny of those decisions, and we do need to have those proper written reasons. So my plea to members, I do appreciate that everybody who's here today and who's taken part in this process has come from the best of intentions. It is not easy, it's very difficult, and we have all of our constituents, many of them come from both sides, giving us all those examples. We are doing the best that we can, certainly to alleviate people's suffering. That, I hope, is the common intention of this House.
Please give way.
Yes, I will.
I thank my honourable friend for giving way. Like my honourable friend, deciding to vote in support of the bill at the second reading was a difficult choice for many, but it was to improve the current situation that exists, to have dignity in dying. So does my honourable friend agree that to impose significant restrictions to a bill, we should not render it ineffective if the bill is passed?
Thank you. Well, today, my honourable friend is right to think about the impact of restrictions. Today, we are all trying in our own different ways to try and improve the bill, whether we believe it in principle or not. I believe that the amendments that I'm talking to do improve that bill, but I should end by saying this. for all of us who are thinking carefully about the bill and all the different parts of it, ask yourselves this question. Does it make it better than the status quo? I believe it does. I believe that there will be fewer, more horrible, painful deaths out there. And that is why I believe these amendments help in that direction. And I remain in support of this bill, and I ask other members to think very carefully too.
Damien Hines.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. And for timeliness, I'm going to speak only about Amendment 101, specifically on adults with Down syndrome or a learning disability, although that amendment does also have direct relevance to new Clause 1 that the Honourable Lady from Hackney has spoken about earlier. And this amendment would disallow medical practitioners from initiating a conversation about assisted dying with a person who has Down syndrome or a learning disability. And I speak primarily from my experience with others in the all-party group on Down syndrome and what we've heard from members of that community, people with Down syndrome, their families and professionals specialising in the condition. Now, of course, there are many, many strong and deeply heartfelt arguments that have been put by colleagues and indeed to all of us, by our constituents, by people in favour of the bill, including families in the very most difficult circumstances to imagine, sometimes actually in unimaginable circumstances, and nobody could question the conclusions that they have come to individually as a result of those circumstances. There are also equally deeply held and heartfelt points that are made to us by people from the other side, from the other perspective, actually also informed by their sometimes unimaginable own or family circumstances. Now, of the arguments put against, Madam Deputy Speaker, I am particularly drawn to those around coercion. But I think it is important that we remember that coercion is itself not entirely a black and white matter. Obviously, there's the very sharpest end of cases where an individual will directly bring pressure to bear on another for their own ends. But there are also many gradations below that, and pressure can be felt very differently also by different people. It may be felt especially so by people who worry they are a burden, which can be a burden on family, on caregivers, on the National Health Service, or indeed more broadly on society. And once assisted dying is an available option, I worry over and above the question of pressure from others about the effect of pressure from self. Now, the bill does stipulate in clause 36 that the Secretary of State will issue guidance, a code of practice, to make sure that the practitioner establishes that there is a clear and settled intention for the person to end their own life, including assessing that that person has capacity to make such a decision. Now, that will, of course, have very material challenges of its own. But in terms of this amendment, I'm talking about the initiation or suggesting or raising of the matter, specifically with an individual who has learning disability or Down syndrome. My right honourable friend.
The critical thing about the Right Honourable Gentleman's amendment, and indeed new clause 16, is they put that on the face of the bill. He's right that codes of practice and statutory guidance can be of value, but what's on the face of the bill seems to me to be fundamentally important in the particular respect you described in terms of coercion.
He is right, of course, and whenever in this House we talk about there's going to be secondary legislation coming, there's guidance coming, there's a code of practice coming, we can only ever take that on trust. And the subject we are debating again today is of such moments that what is on the face of the bill is that much more important. And given the scale of the decision that people can be making as a result of this legislation, I think it is right that an additional layer of caution is applied by legislators. Now, obviously it's important not to generalise, and every single individual is an individual. But it is the case that people with Down syndrome may, indeed often do, exhibit distinct social characteristics, including great sociability, empathy, a strong desire to please others and seek positive social feedback, while also being particularly sensitive in many cases to criticism or perceived failure. And this, of course, can compound with issues around communication and comprehension.
And Madam Deputy Speaker, you don't need to term what can result as coercion to worry about what might happen as a result in that context. So I repeat, Madam Deputy Speaker, this in terms of my Amendment 101 and also new clause 1 is about initiating that conversation and making sure there are additional safeguards to starting that conversation. And I urge the House to apply here caution commensurate with the gravity of the path that could then be embarked upon.
Cat Eccles.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. And I rise to speak against Amendments 102, 85, New Clause 16, 38 and New Clause 9. In my varied NHS career, I've seen all aspects of death and disease. And as healthcare professionals, we commit to do first no harm. And as medicine advances at breakneck speed, we are able to preserve life far beyond what could have been thought possible in the past. However, I've seen many times when I feel that preserving life can be harmful. Life-prolonging treatments do not always improve quality of life, and patients suffer pain and discomfort as well as mental distress. Friends and family have to watch their loved ones go through these difficult experiences, and I believe patients should have a choice to end their life with dignity when faced with a terminal illness. The safeguards within this bill have been significantly strengthened at committee, and amendments seeking to further delay the process are simply unnecessary. Oral evidence was given by multiple experts, including Professor Chris Whitty, that we must be mindful not to overcomplicate the process to a point that no one can access an assisted death. Amendment 80 seeks to impose an unnecessary restriction by requiring the terminal illness to cause severe pain and discomfort that cannot be relieved by palliative treatment. The bill already requires that symptoms cannot reasonably be relieved, and it is important to remember that terminal illness is more than just pain alone. Amendment 102 states that remediable suicide risk factors be addressed before any preliminary discussion. Again, this is covered in the bill, with multiple checks on mental capacity and mental illness. Suicide risk is complex and fluid, and as I know myself from my own struggles, it is possible to feel suicidal but not want to die. This is another vague and unnecessary barrier without clear legal or clinical definition. New Clause 9 and New Clause 16 and Amendment 5 all seek to undermine multiple layers of assessment, independent oversight and professional accountability, where safeguards are already strong and multifaceted. Amendment 38 calls for patients to only qualify if they have not refused further treatment or taken life-shortening steps. It is morally wrong to force anyone to accept medical treatment they do not wish to have. This bill is about choice and autonomy, and this amendment undermines freedom to make deeply personal decisions about one's care. This is not a one-size-fits-all pathway and must always be a patient-centred approach. My constituent Mark shared the story of his sister, who sadly died from a rare form of terminal cancer 2 years ago, and despite receiving the very best palliative care, her pain could not be relieved, and she begged her relatives to help her end her life, which obviously they could not do. And Harjean's father suffered a long and painful death as his body gave way to the point that he could not even swallow. This was not how he would have chosen to end his days, and his family had to share his suffering as there was no other option. The current system is clearly inadequate, unsafe, and lacks any compassionate and dignified options for end-of-life patients. I do not consider assisted dying to be any alternative to end-of-life care, and I know many others in this House, will continue to campaign for better funding and resources in palliative care hospices. And I believe the two must go hand in hand. I'm going to keep going because of time. Other countries which have implemented an assisted dying law have in turn increased funding and access to palliative care significantly, ensuring a fairer and more equitable range of options for patients. I believe the safeguards within this bill are more than adequate, and it's important to remember that doctors, healthcare professionals are constantly looking out for consent, competence and possible coercion within medical and social care settings. I'm almost done, so I'm going to keep going. Around 20 people per day die in excruciating pain and discomfort in spite of the very best palliative care. And I believe we, as lawmakers, owe it to those people and their families and the thousands more who will die in the meantime to continue this debate towards reform. Thank you.
Sian Berry. Deputy Speaker, I want to speak very briefly as I spoke in favour of the bill at its second reading in November as well. My name is on it and I've long supported the campaigns that want to see a change in the law, including Dignity in Dying and Humanist UK, of which I declare I am a member and patron. Since the second reading vote, I have met with and listened to a range of groups, professionals and individual people, mainly those who have concerns and those who want to see further changes made. In Brighton, this has regularly included constituents at my surgery, as well as a group of leaders of local faith groups and charities who provide support to different vulnerable groups, including disabled people. Today, we debate around half of more than 100 proposed amendments, led by several from the Honourable Member for Spen Valley, who has set out so well how she has put them together based on her own very detailed work with civil servants and listening, including to opponents as well. I cannot commend her work and that of the committee more. The new amendments from the proposer include welcome changes to transparency rules and how the processes and decisions made are reported and scrutinised. And we also have many carefully drafted and clear proposals from other MPs too. On eligibility, I continue to support people with slowly progressive neurological diseases like motor neuron disease, as reflected in Amendment 4, which I have signed and which was argued so well for the Honourable Member for Harrogate. And today, I don't want to list lots of amendments. I do want to briefly set out the approach I will take to the amendments being debated today while listening to the rest of the debate and then deciding how to vote, because I believe that we must end up with the strongest, clearest and fairest process for making decisions, safeguarding against abuse, scrutinising the use of the policy after it becomes law and providing the very best and most appropriate help to people who want this choice at the end of their lives. I aim to strongly back amendments that demand greater reporting and recording of decisions made and for transparency, including financial transparency, demographic data and other statistics from those who are supervising decisions and providing the new service, including the new supervising commissioner. The ability to monitor the implementation of this policy, ensure it's working as intended and detect any problems immediately is really important to me. I will also back changes in the process that ask for more training for those taking part in decisions and to ensure fair and effective communication throughout, including new language requirements. However, I am not currently aiming to support some of the amendments that I think place undue, compulsory, additional burdens, hurdles, intrusions or demands on those people who are applying for permission to make this choice beyond what is in the current bill. Because I know from what I have heard from the experiences of so many of my constituents in Brighton Pavilion and from the statistics that the people asking for this choice will be, by definition, at the end of a horrible disease, very often terminal cancer, which they have fought and fought with their doctors for a long time, and that they will now be facing their final months in a situation of potentially huge suffering over which they have no control and fear greatly. We must all remember that only dying people are eligible, and in the vast majority of these cases, the person's eligibility, capacity and reasons will be more than clear to the decision makers, and I believe we must enable those cases to be approved in a respectful, caring and compassionate way, and as swiftly as the current bill process allows. In other cases where things are less clear, I agree. Many more questions may need to be asked, and I believe that the professionals currently tasked in this rigorous process under the bill's proposals, will be very well placed to judge when more information, consultation and investigation will be necessary. The current rules, along with the new amendments I support, mean that they will also have to account very clearly for what they ask and what they decide under effective scrutiny. Therefore, I cannot support some of the proposals that will make every single applicant subject to additional steps, interrogation, somebody appointed to argue against them, extra processes, compulsory psychological investigation. To me, these are intrusive. They are effectively barriers in helping eligible people. Once I'm on my last paragraph, I'm really sorry. In helping eligible people to make their own choice for when and how to die at the end of all they've already suffered, I truly believe we must not make the process of gaining permission any more harder or more traumatic than we need to. And while I am listening hard to the arguments made, quite a few of the amendments being proposed today do cross this line for me. These momentous decisions about our deaths must be led by compassion and not be made to seem like yet another battle to face by people who've already given their all to staying alive.
Naz Shah.
Can I first of all thank all members for supporting my amendments number 14 and number 18, and can I also acknowledge and respond to the sponsor who has said she's happy to accept my amendment as of this morning. Madam Deputy Speaker, this increases my concern insofar as the Honourable Member has also, from Spen Valley, has also indicated that there might need to change some of the wording for it to be accepted. In that vein, given that I haven't seen the wording of this new amendment, or proposal of this new amendment, I cannot accept it in its current form until I actually see it in writing and until I'm able to scrutinise that and then make an informed choice. In addition to that, Madam Deputy Speaker, this also raises a further question, and that question is this. This was only told to me this morning after 9:30 on the floor of this House. Yeah. This was not discussed with me. This has not been, and I'm not sure whether the sponsor has discussed it with the ministers, because this very argument has been hashed out in that bill committee, where many of us spent weeks and weeks scrutinising line by line. And indeed, the honourable member's own amendment 181 attempted during bill committee to strengthen that particular clause 2 that we are talking about in this amendment. And at that point, the ministers, on their feet during the bill committee, outlining their neutrality, did give an opinion that this was not workable. So those amendments that were tabled then, that many of his colleagues argued then, the ministers said were not workable in the government's opinion. So I also want to understand, what is it in the government's opinion that has now changed? Have those assessments been made by the honourable member or the government that these amendments could now be accepted? What this speaks to, and I really, really want to emphasise this to all members listening and the public at home, is this process is flawed, fundamentally flawed. This is not how we make legislation. I take my responsibility, as I'm sure everybody in this House does, extremely, extremely seriously. This is literally a matter of life and death. If this bill passes and it doesn't have the safeguards, there's no coming back from those decisions. So let's go back to my happy to give one.
As my friend knows, being on the Bill Committee with me, I had that same advice from ministers that they disagreed with the wording of some of my amendments, yet they were accepted by the bill sponsor, accepted by the committee, and now sit in the wording on the face of the bill. So we are going to the bill sponsor's position, and the position put to this House will now be that those amendments are not in line with the government's position. So what is her view on that, that we are going to be asked to support that?
Thank my honourable friend for that intervention, because he's absolutely right. That is the problem with this bill and this process, and how we are being taught, we are being given things on the face of this, on the happy to give way.
I thank her for giving way, and I thank her for her passionate contribution. But this is exactly how we make law. We take evidence. We take evidence. We have discussions.
Could I respectfully remind honourable members that we are here for the report stage to debate the amendments to this legislation, not to discuss how the process of law is being made. Naz Shah.
Much, Madam Deputy Speaker, and this is about my amendment, because Amendment 18 is very much about anorexia. This amendment was debated. It has been hashed out time and time again, and today I come to this House, whilst in the seat, I'm told the member is minded to accept it, without any discussion, without any... I don't know what risk assessments or assessments the government has made, so how can I speak to that amendment when I don't have those details? I can tell plenty of people. I can say to this House that Chelsea Roth, the expert on anorexia, gave evidence to the committee. I can talk about how the clinicians of every single charity, the major charities on eating disorder, have made it really, really clear that if this bill goes through, it is not fit for purpose and people will fall through that loophole. Because I don't have that information in front of me, I cannot speak to it. All I can continue. Sorry, I'm going to make some progress. I'm going to make some progress now. So I sincerely appreciate the guidance from Madam Deputy Speaker and the Speaker and all across this House. The clerks themselves have been really, really helpful. But coming back to the amendments, what I will say is this. In Oregon, in the States, 60 women were given assisted death. Every single one of them, 100% of them, were told they had the capacity. We have an issue in this country with there are 11 cases that have gone to the court of protection, Madam Deputy Speaker. 10 of them, my understanding is 9 of them, sorry, have all been told they do not have the capacity, but the doctors have been given the permission to not continue to feed them. That's an issue for us. So there is an issue of capacity when it comes to this. There is a second issue in relation to the second amendment that I've tabled. And again, I'm speaking to that because we cannot accept, and even if the member does accept it in entirety, in word for word, my first amendment, we do not close the loophole with the second amendment. And the second amendment that I've tabled, which I'm speaking to, is Amendment 38. So, if we have somebody with diabetes, and the honourable member spoke very passionately about diabetes, and I know the experience because I was gestationally diabetic on 3 occasions and insulin dependent, and I appreciate the risk as being a pre-diabetic as well. If somebody decides not to take insulin, if somebody decides they do not want to have dialysis, they would bring themselves within the scope of this bill as it is written. That is a fact. It is a fact that as this bill is written, it does not, contrary to many people who have been on the radio and been on other places saying it excludes people from mental health, it does not say on the face of this bill that the mental health is excluded. It does not say that. It does not say that, and because it's not, I'm not going to give way because I'm going to make progress. I'm very conscious there are lots of colleagues. I remember sitting here, more than 100 of us who didn't get to speak in this debate the first time it was heard in November, and there are many people who might not get to speak today. So I am trying to be, but I am feeling really disheartened, and the reason I feel disheartened is because we've spent, like other members have pointed out, who on this committee, so much time rehashing these arguments, haven't we? And there were opportunities to fix this bill, rather than me having to put these amendments down and others having to put these amendments down and taking up the time and not giving those the opportunity to speak who would have otherwise spoken, Madam Deputy Speaker. So in relation, coming back to my amendment, I've lost complete track of time. I'm sure the Madam Deputy Speaker will indicate I need to be finishing off. So I will come to my concluding remarks. And they are simply this. I've spoken to parents. I've spoken to parents of a girl who had TIAD, which is diabetes and complexities of anorexia. They came to Parliament and they said the law that helped them, the law that assisted them because their daughter wanted to go to Dignitas, was because it would have been illegal. And that's the law we today are trying to change. If the safeguard in this bill fail even once, it will be a young woman like Jessica who dies. It will be parents like Leslie and Neil who lose a child. Madam Deputy Speaker, that is a terrible tragedy no family should ever have to endure. And no one in this House will be able to say truthfully that we did not know or didn't see this coming. That is not compassion. That is abandonment. I will not be complicit in that, and I hope this House will not be either. That is why we must act now. Amendment 14 and Amendment 38, each of those close a different and dangerous loophole. One without the other is not enough. If we are serious about protecting vulnerable people, this House must support both amendments. Thank you.
Members will be aware there are still many wishing to contribute. Could I ask that contributions are kept to 5 minutes? Kip Malthouse.
Madam Deputy Speaker, I am grateful to you. I'm grateful to the sponsoring Minister for having put me on the Bill Committee, where, in my view, we did some excellent work. And while we've heard an awful lot of claims about the process today, I think anybody objective who reads the bill that's now being reported to the House will recognise that it is a strong piece of work that is measured and seeks to strike a balance in what is a difficult area of complexity and humanity and compassion and morality. Before I move on to just discussing 3 or 4 of the amendments, Madam Deputy Speaker, I just wanted to bring the House back to what we're trying to deal with here. We are dealing with a set of people who have been told that their struggle with disease is over, that they are heading towards an inevitable death. There is nothing more that medical science can do for them. And what we're trying to do today is to give them the chance to face death on their own terms. That's the simple mission that the House has been set. The second thing I just wanted members to contemplate as they look at this slew of amendments is, while it is easy to look at each amendment individually and see its merits or demerits, we have to bear in mind the machine we are building as a whole, and the fact that we are putting those people through this process at a time when they are facing the end of that struggle. They are thinking about what the nature of their death is going to be like. They are talking to their friends and family, putting their affairs in order and being concerned about when that awful day is going to come. And we have to have some compassion in the process, as well as compassion in the purpose. And so when you consider some of the amendments, which I'm going to highlight in a moment, please have in your mind this idea that we have to put these people through a possibly 2-month process at a moment when they are severely time limited, very often to less than 6 months. So, for example, new clause 7 and 50, my honourable friend from Meriden, which seeks to restrict the number of patients that doctors can deal with in any 12-month period. This will severely restrict access and may mean that patients who are partway through the process have to suddenly change because their doctor is time limited and pushed out. That's notwithstanding the multiple safeguards that are already in the process. Similarly, and my right honourable friend for Kenilworth and Southern gave an interesting speech about Amendment 47. Again, in this amendment, he's creating another step, another delay, another set of problems for the dying person to overcome, or issues for them to address. And in his amendment, I'm sure he's a much better lawyer than me, but I found it odd that he was effectively creating an inexhaustive list of individuals who could be called upon in any circumstance who might be, in inverted commas, properly interested in the welfare of that individual. Now, to me, the person who should be the most interested in their future is the person themselves. And any step we take that cuts across their privacy, their autonomy, and the alacrity with which they can seek this solution to their impending or perceived agony seems to me a step too far. I don't understand how practically the Commission is supposed to ascertain. Is it neighbours? Is it friends? Is it just family? What is the definition of family? We need to put, in a moment, we need to put that contemplation and how they want to handle their death squarely in the hands of the dying person. By all means.
Thank you to the honourable member for letting me raise an intervention. You mentioned that the person is autonomous and should be protected from inquiries around them. But what if that person is not autonomous because they are being coercively controlled by a partner? And what if that partner has prevented them from reaching out to their family to let them know about the fact they are going to take an assisted death? Would it not be a great safeguard to make sure that the panel and all of those doctors around them had ascertained that the family had been told?
Well, the Honourable Lady makes a good point, and it was a compelling point made at committee, and certainly one that we recognised, and that's why her amendments that were tabled at committee were adopted, specifically on training for everybody involved in the process, that they should be sensitised to detecting those issues, and also that any doctor in the process, and indeed the panel, might want to know why family are not being informed. That's specifically why a social worker is put on the panel, to understand the psychosocial environment in which the person that is taking that decision. But fundamentally, in the end, if I am facing my death in a matter of weeks, and I decide in my capacity that I don't want to inform my family, that is my choice. That is my decision. Now, I may have to explain why to doctors, but...
On that point, can I remind members that we really are very short of time? Kit Malthouse.
I'm grateful, Madam Chair. I'll be swift. That is my choice, and this bill is rooted in giving autonomy to those who have capacity and to those who are facing a death, and we should take care to tread carefully upon that right. And then finally, Madam Chair, two amendments by my honourable friend for Reigate. First of all, new clause 16, which is saying that somebody has to be substantially motivated or can't be substantially motivated by certain considerations he's put in the bill. I don't really understand what substantially motivated is meant to mean. And to me, this misunderstands the complexity of what it must be like to be told you're dying. Right? The things that might run through your head, the affairs that you might have to deal with, the news you have to break with your family, the impact it's going to have on your possibly small children, all of these form a cocktail of motivations. But the one thing that I've learned over the last 10 years of campaigning and spending lots of time with dying and bereaved people is that towards the end of their life they have an absolute clarity about what they want. Absolute clarity, because it's become clear to them towards the end what their death is going to be like. And at the very least, they want to have the card in their back pocket to play if they require it. Remember, these are people who are facing death, who are struggling with death, and we have to give them the power to advance over it. And then finally, and then I'm just conscious of time, finally, the Amendment A to New Clause 10, which I think we might be facing in division this afternoon, possibly. This is a very difficult amendment, and we debated it, a very similar amendment at committee to talk about. We are very clear as sponsors of the bill that there should be a conscientious objection clause that is strengthened by New Clause 10 to allow individuals to opt out. But allowing an employer, any employer, to say that any employee in their employment cannot then participate if they decide not to seems to me a step too far and could prove to have unintended consequences. First of all, every healthcare trust in the country, the board of it will become a battle for control for those who oppose and those who don't. We might find that in care homes, as the Honourable Gentleman for Gainsborough, Right Honourable Gentleman for Gainsborough said, in care homes, people may suddenly find they have to uproot themselves after years of living there to relocate, to get the kind of death that they want. And in effect, what this does is prioritise the rights of somebody who's providing accommodation over the rights of the dying. And as I said at second reading, in my view, as they face their end, we should prioritise the rights of the dying.
It would be unprecedented to put a formal time limit on. Please, can members listen to the stricture that we are very short of time. Lizzie Collins.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I was rising to speak to new clauses 1 and 10, but I'll restrict myself to new clause 1 for the sake of time. New clause 1 says that no health professional should raise assisted dying first unless the patient has already raised it. So if a patient doesn't mention the issue, doesn't specifically ask for it, then a doctor would be entirely prohibited from even mentioning it. This is problematic for many different reasons. It goes against good medical practice and it's actively opposed by the British Medical Association. For me, this clause undermines the hard-won rights of people to be fully informed of their medical options and would make the application of the bill unfair and unequal to the detriment, particularly, of marginalised people. Now, new clause 1 would have a very... I'll happily give way.
I thank my honourable friend for giving way. Just this week on the Health and Social Care Select Committee, we heard from vulnerable service users and they talked about white coat syndrome, that people who, when given options, faced with medical professionals, are more likely to be pushed into doing it. And that's the concern here, and that's why this amendment's here. And I don't know how I'm going to vote on the bill, but I am minded to support this amendment because of what I've heard from people from vulnerable communities.
Amendments too need to be brief. Lizzie Collins.
Madam Deputy Speaker, and I thank my honourable friend for his intervention. I will expand on this a little bit more. But that's exactly why all options need to be on the table. That's exactly why good medical practice has to have all options on the table, because patients should not be being influenced by the opinions, whether philosophical or medical, of a doctor. What they should be influenced by is by full and informed consent. And I believe new clause 1 would chill those discussions. It would limit the option of an assisted death to those already in the know, those who are most medically literate, those who are best off and least marginalised in society. It would result in unequal access to a legal process. It flies in the face of good medical practice. Good medical practice has moved away from this paternalistic idea that harmed patients and took away people's individual control. After many years' fight, mainly by women and by marginalised communities, it's now established that good healthcare practice means patients having full information in order to make their own decisions. I'm mindful of time, so I'm going to continue. Why now then, as a chamber, would we choose to give patients, to hide information from patients on their options? So many years people have been put through this. Informed consent to treatment, including end-of-life care, is only informed when it includes all options. There's also the practical element. You know, what would count as a patient raising it first? Would they have to make a specific statement? Would they have to use specific language? It would make a legal and medical minefield for doctors and patients. I would like to finish. I'm very mindful of time, so I'm going to finish with this. Colleagues may wish to look at the NHS Constitution. It says this: you have the right to be involved in planning and making decisions about your health and care with your care provider or providers, including your end-of-life care, and to be given information and support to enable you to do this. That is only the case if people are, in fact, given that full information. All people should have access to full information on matters of care. To do otherwise is to deny people their decision. It is paternalistic, and we should be moving away from that model, and people have fought so hard for that to happen. We have a chance today, colleagues, to make sure this legislation is the best it can possibly be, and it's been a pleasure to listen to the contributions from across the chamber. When third reading arrives, I am minded to support the amended bill, because the current situation for terminally ill people, the current situation with no safeguards, with no protection and with no choice, is absolutely unsupportable. Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker.
Dr. Ben Spencer.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. And I beg to move amendments 18, 30, 31, 17 and 32 in my name. I'll start with Amendment 18. There have been many moral arguments put forward for the need of this bill, both in debates inside and outside this place. And the vast majority have focused on the prevention of suffering. There's also been desire for greater control at the end of life, but irreversible suffering has predominated. The principle of bodily autonomy, one which I strongly support, in the context of full decision-making capacity and with certain important caveats, is used to justify the rights which this bill will grant. However, putting aside the debate surrounding the bill and focusing on the text and clauses itself, which is the task we face today at report stage, the provisions of this bill are silent of suffering, silent on control, and silent on all but a terminal illness with fewer than 6 months prognosis. If the principle is that we must prevent irreversible suffering, then all those suffering irreversibly should be able to seek physician-assisted suicide. If the principle is that we should give people control, another level of expression of bodily autonomy, then all adults who truly and freely consent with full decision-making capacity should be able to seek physician-assisted suicide. If these principles are circumscribed to an arbitrary definition of terminal illness, the inexorable conclusions must be that either their suffering or autonomy is more important than others, or their lives have less value. And we've seen that subtly imported into this debate. When requesting an assisted death is framed